Silas Vance didn't even look at her when he said it. He just set her dead husband's pocket watch down on the kitchen table, the one Thomas had carried every single day of their marriage, slid it across the wood like he was paying a bar tab, and said, "You've got until Friday. After that, whatever's left on the property becomes mine." Mara didn't cry, not right then. She picked up the watch, turned it over once, and she looked at this man, this broad-shouldered, silver-haired man who had shaken Thomas's hand at the altar and called her daughter. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she had never been family to him. She had been furniture. Tolerated, now inconvenient. "Friday," he said again, and walked out of the room. If you've ever been made to feel like you don't belong somewhere you gave everything to, stay with us. Because what Mara does next will either make you cheer out loud or leave you absolutely speechless. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single chapter of this story. And while you're at it, drop a like and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The town of Red Hollow sat in the crease between two mountain ridges, like something the landscape had forgotten to finish. It had a general store, a livery, a church, a saloon that doubled as a courthouse when needed, and exactly the kind of people you'd expect to find in a place like that. Practical, proud, and slow to change their minds about anything, including each other. Mara Vance had lived on the edge of that town for 3 years. Not quite in it. Not quite of it. She had come to Red Hollow as Thomas Vance's wife, which meant she had come in through the side door of a family that already had its opinions arranged like furniture, heavy, settled, and not about to be moved. The Vance family had land, livestock, a name that people in the territory recognized, and Silas at the head of it all, 62 years old, built like a fence post driven deep into hard ground, and possessed of the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything, at least not in his own memory. Thomas was different. Thomas had his father's jaw and none of his father's coldness. He laughed easily. He listened when Mara talked, which sounds like a small thing until you've spent time around people who don't. He had picked her out of a crowded harvest dance in Clover Falls, where Mara had been standing near the wall, not quite sure she'd been invited to take up more space, and he had walked straight to her like she was the only still point in a spinning room. She had loved him for that, among other things. But Thomas had been gone 8 months now. A fever. Fast and stupid and utterly indifferent to who it took. He was fine on a Tuesday and buried by a Saturday, and the speed of it had left Mara with the sensation of having reached for something solid and found nothing there, just air where a person used to be. She was 29 years old. She was a widow. She was, in Silas Vance's estimation, no longer his concern. He had made that clear in the way men like Silas make things clear, not with cruelty exactly, but with a kind of deliberate administrative precision that was somehow worse. The morning after the funeral, he had come into the kitchen where Mara was sitting with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't drunk from, and he had placed Thomas's pocket watch on the table, and he had said what he said, and then he had left the room before she could respond. Friday. 4 days. She had taken stock of what she had. The watch. A wool blanket Thomas's mother had made before she died. $46 saved from the household accounts, which she had managed because Silas couldn't be bothered, and Thomas trusted her. A pair of good boots. A dog named Bracken, a scruffy, barrel-chested mutt who had adopted Thomas 3 winters back and transferred his loyalties to Mara after the funeral with a straightforwardness she found unexpectedly comforting. And 10 sheep. Her sheep. Thomas had given them to her as a wedding gift, half as a joke and half because he knew she'd wanted something of her own. The paperwork was in her name. She had checked. Silas wanted those sheep too. He'd mentioned it, sideways, in the same conversation. Not a demand, just a mention. The way a man mentions something when he's already decided it's going to happen and is giving you the courtesy of hearing it first. Mara had not slept much in the 4 days that followed. She had lain awake in the narrow room off the kitchen. Her room, the one Silas had allocated to her when she and Thomas moved onto the property, which told you something about how Silas had always seen her. And she had stared at the ceiling and done arithmetic. Not emotional arithmetic. Actual numbers. What she had. What things cost. What was possible. On Thursday morning, the day before her deadline, she walked into Elias Crow's general store. Elias Crow was a compact, watchful man in his mid-50s who had run the store for going on 20 years. He wasn't cruel, but he was careful, and careful men in Red Hollow tended to keep their distance from widows with uncertain futures. He looked up from his ledger when Mara came in, and his expression did the thing expressions do when someone is trying to appear neutral and not quite managing it. "Mrs. Vance," he said. "Mara," she said. She'd been correcting people on that for 3 years. "I need to ask you about a parcel of land." Elias set down his pen. "Which parcel?" "The limestone tract, north of the Ridley Cut, the one with the cave." There was a pause. Elias's face did something complicated. "Raven's Hollow. That's what people call it." "Mara." He said her name carefully, like he was handing her something fragile and wasn't sure she'd catch it. "That land hasn't sold in 11 years. 2 men tried homesteading it and gave up. The soil is limestone and scrub. You can't farm it. You can barely graze on it. The cave floods in spring and the whole ridge is exposed to the north wind." "How much?" Mara asked. Elias looked at her for a long moment. She was a heavy-set woman, Mara, broad through the shoulders and hips, built solid in the way that the particular cruelty of the frontier tended to notice and comment on. Because people needed somewhere to put their assumptions, and her body had always been a convenient place to start. Elias wasn't a cruel man, but she could see him doing the calculations that people did when they looked at her, adding up what they saw and subtracting what they couldn't be bothered to find out. $20, he said finally. "I think I remember the asking price being 20. I'll buy it." Another pause. Longer this time. "Mara, it's rock. It's scrub. It's a big hole in a hillside." "I know what it is," she said. "I've walked it." That surprised him. She could tell. He hadn't known she'd gone out there. Nobody had. She'd done it 2 weeks before Thomas died, actually. Before she'd known she'd need it. Before she'd had any particular reason to go. She'd just been walking, the way she sometimes walked when the house felt too full of other people's certainties, and she'd found Raven's Hollow more or less by accident, and she'd stood at the mouth of that cave in the late afternoon light and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She'd felt interested, not hopeful. Not yet, just interested. The way you feel when you're looking at a problem and you can see, distantly, the shape of a solution, even before you can name it. The cave was enormous. That was the first thing. Bigger than it looked from outside. Dry limestone walls and a high ceiling and the faint, constant smell of cool mineral air. No standing water. It would need checking in spring, Elias was right about that, but there was no evidence of flooding in the high sections. The floor was uneven but solid. The natural geometry of the place meant the wind that scoured the ridge never quite reached the interior. It was, and this was the word that had lodged itself in her mind and refused to leave, it was sheltered. She had stood there a long time. Then she had walked back to the Vance property and not said anything to anyone. Now she paid Elias $20 from her 46. He wrote out the deed transfer with the expression of a man who has decided that this is not his business and is filing it away accordingly. He handed her the paperwork. She folded it once and put it in her coat pocket next to Thomas's watch. "You planning to live out there?" he asked. He wasn't being unkind. He genuinely couldn't figure it out. "Yes," she said. He looked at her again, that look. The one she'd been getting her whole life from one version of person or another. The look that was measuring her and finding her unlikely. "The winter will be bad this year," he said. "Earliest frost in a decade. Way some folks are reading the signs." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm going now." She left the store. She heard him say something to himself, low, as she went out the door. She didn't turn around to hear what it was. She went back to the Vance property one last time. She moved the sheep from the paddock, which required more patience than drama. Sheep are not cooperative creatures under the best of circumstances, and these were no exception. She tied a rope lead to the most manageable one, a heavy ewe she'd been calling Margaret for 2 years, and the rest followed Margaret the way sheep do, which is to say badly, but eventually. Bracken worked the edges with a calm efficiency that was more effective than anything Mara could have managed alone. She did not go into the main house. She did not say goodbye to Silas. She had thought about it, briefly. There was a part of her, the part that still couldn't entirely believe this was happening, that the life she'd built over 3 years was just being handed back to her in pieces. that wanted to stand in his kitchen and make him look at her, make him acknowledge that she was a person, that she had mattered to his son, that this was wrong. But she had looked at the paperwork in her pocket, and she had thought about the cave, and she had decided that Silas Vance had already taken enough of her time. She walked north with her dog and her 10 sheep and $40, and she did not look back. The road to Raven's Hollow was not really a road. It was a suggestion, a series of disturbed rocks and trampled grass that indicated humans had passed this way before and made decisions about it. The path cut through scrubby pine and overexposed limestone shelves and up a gradual ridge that put Red Hollow at your back and the gray-brown landscape of the Northern Territory in front of you. It was cold, not yet brutal, but the cold that's practicing, the kind that comes off the mountain in the morning and doesn't fully leave even when the sun is high, as though it's staking out territory for what comes next. Mara walked for 2 hours. She'd made the walk twice before, scouting, once before Thomas died, once after, when she was already starting to understand what her options were. The sheep were slow, and she was careful not to push them. Margaret kept pulling toward the scrub grass, and Mara kept redirecting her with the patience of someone who has learned that force is less efficient than persistence. She was thinking about the cave ceiling, the high passages toward the back, where she'd noticed the limestone was shot through with narrow fissures, the way the air moved through those fissures when you held your hand up to them. Not a draft, not quite, but a circulation. The cave breathed. Not many people would have noticed that. Mara had noticed it because she'd grown up in a different kind of cold, the damp, terrible cold of a valley with no drainage. And she'd learned young that the difference between a survivable winter and a killing one was often in the details of how air moved. She was also thinking about the wall she'd noticed on the eastern side of the cave, the one where the limestone surface was always faintly darker than the surrounding rock, with a particular quality of shadow that she'd taken a closer look at and confirmed was moisture, not flooding, not seepage exactly, just a slow, persistent mineral weeping that the rock had been doing probably for centuries. Barely noticeable, easy to dismiss. Mara had crouched in front of that wall for a long time. She'd come back to it on her second visit with a tin cup, positioned it under the darkest section of rock, and gone away for an hour. When she came back, there was nearly a quarter-inch of water in the bottom of the cup. A quarter-inch an hour wasn't a lot, but it was something. It was reliable. And on the frontier, reliable beats spectacular every single time. She was thinking about these things because thinking about them was more useful than thinking about the sound of Silas's voice when he said Friday, or the way the farmhouse had felt empty in a different way than it felt empty before Thomas died, or the fact that she was 29 years old and walking away from everything she'd spent 3 years building toward a cave that 2 previous homesteaders had abandoned. She was thinking about practical problems because practical problems had answers. When she finally cleared the last ridge and the cave mouth came into view, that dark, wide aperture in the limestone face, like the hillside itself had exhaled and never closed its mouth again, Mara stopped. Bracken stopped beside her and looked up at her face. "All right," she said, to him, to herself, to nobody, and the hillside. "Let's get to work." The first week at Raven's Hollow was the kind of hard that strips away whatever ideas you had about yourself and leaves you with the more compact, honest version. Mara had known it would be difficult. She had not entirely known what difficult meant until she was living inside it. The sheep needed an enclosure before anything else. Without it, they would wander. Without them, she had nothing. No wool for warmth, no lambs in spring, no future worth planning for. She had brought a hand axe and a coil of rope, and the belief that the timber she'd seen on the eastern slope could be worked into something serviceable. She had not entirely accounted for how long it takes one person to fell a tree, trim it, drag it across uneven ground, and set it in a limestone floor that does not want to accept posts. The first day she managed 3 posts. Her hands were bleeding by noon. She ate dried meat and flatbread that she'd packed from Red Hollow and drank water from the tin cup she positioned under the dripping wall. The collection was slow, and she supplemented it from a rain puddle farther down the slope. But the cave water was coming, a little at a time, and that mattered. She slept the first night inside the cave mouth, wrapped in the wool blanket with Bracken pressed against her back, and she was not too proud to admit, in the absolute privacy of her own skull, that she was frightened. Not of the dark, not even of the cold. Not yet. She was frightened of the size of what she'd taken on and the smallness of what she had to take it on with. But fear is information, not instruction. Her mother had told her that once, in a different context and a different life, and Mara had never entirely forgotten it. She did not sleep much. She was back at the timber by first light. By the end of the fourth day, she had a rough enclosure. It wasn't elegant. The posts were uneven, and the rope lashing was not what anyone would call professional, but the structure stood and the sheep were inside it, and the interior of the cave was deep enough that the enclosure sat in genuine shelter. The wind that had begun picking up on the ridge never touched them in here. The temperature difference between outside and inside was not dramatic, but it was real, several degrees at least, and in the coming weeks those degrees would matter enormously. So began on the cabin. She had chosen a position just inside the cave mouth, where there was enough natural light during the day, but enough overhead rock to cut the worst of the wind. She built the walls from logs, clay, and moss. The clay from a deposit she'd found 20 feet inside the cave, the moss from the shadowed side of the limestone face, where it grew thick and dense and slightly damp. She packed the moss between logs for insulation and sealed gaps with clay, and when that dried, she went over it again. She layered wool from her sheep's heavy coats. They needed shearing eventually anyway, between the inner and outer sections of the walls where she could, and the result was ugly and lumpy and kept the heat in with an efficiency that surprised her. The stove came later. She had bought a few pieces of scrap iron and some basic hardware from Elias. She'd spent more of her remaining money than she was comfortable with, but the alternative was freezing, and she was not going to freeze. She built the stove body from clay and iron and found a natural fissure in the cave ceiling above the cabin's corner that drew air upward with enough force to serve as a flue. She had never built a stove before. It took her 5 attempts, and the inside of the cabin was full of smoke for 2 full days before she got the draft right. When the first clean, warm air finally began flowing through the little cabin, when she sat back on her heels and put her hand near the flue and felt the smoke moving the right direction, out and up and away, she did something she hadn't done in months. She laughed. It was not a graceful laugh. It was rough and surprised and possibly a little hysterical, and Bracken looked at her with the expression dogs use when they're not sure whether something is wrong. But it was real, and it was hers. She was still sitting there when she heard hoofbeats on the ridge path. She came out of the cave to find Elias Crow on horseback, looking at the sheep enclosure and the rough walls of the cabin with an expression she couldn't quite read. He had a pack horse behind him with some supplies. She hadn't ordered anything, which meant he'd decided on his own to come out here. "I wanted to see," he said simply. She crossed her arms. "And?" He looked at the enclosure. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the length of makeshift gutter she'd attached to the cave wall above the dripping limestone, the one that was now channeling the moisture into a proper barrel instead of a tin cup. "That gutter," he said. "Did you think of that yourself?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You've got water coming off the rock." "Just enough." "More than I expected." Another silence. He shifted in his saddle. "Silas knows you bought it," he said. "He's not happy." "I didn't expect him to be. He came into the store yesterday, asked me what I knew about the land." Elias paused. "I told him I'd drawn up the deed transfer, and that was all I knew." Mara nodded. She appreciated that without needing to say so. Elias started unpacking the supply horse. He'd brought lamp oil, salt, dried beans, some nails she hadn't asked for, but immediately understood the value of. He set everything at the cave mouth without making it into a moment. Just set it down and started talking about the weather, which turned out to be what he'd actually come to say. "It's going to be bad," he said. "Worse than I told you in the store, if I'm honest. Bill Reedy's been watching the geese formations, and there's a rancher up at Copper Ridge saying this is going to be the worst winter in 20 years. I'm not saying this to frighten you." He stopped, looked at her. "Actually, I am saying it to frighten you. A little. Because if you're not set by the time the first blizzard comes in, Mara—" "I'll be set," she said. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the store. But something was different this time. The look had shifted, still measuring, but the math was coming out different. "Those sheep look healthy," he said. "They are." He nodded slowly, said nothing else about it. Climbed back on his horse, said he'd check in when the weather allowed, and rode back down the ridge. Mara stood at the cave mouth and watched him go. Then she turned and went back to work. She did not know then that someone had followed Elias out here at a distance. She did not know that 3 days later, when she went to check the sheep enclosure in the early morning and found the eastern rope lashing cut through on one section, not frayed, not worn, cut clean and deliberate, that it was connected to the rider she hadn't seen watching from the pine line above the ridge. She stood and looked at that cut rope for a long moment. Then she looked up toward the pines. Nothing moved, just the wind in the branches and the distant sound of something settling in the rock. She was cold. Her back hurt. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours and her hands were still raw from the timber work. She had $41 left and winter was coming, and someone had just made it clear that they considered her enough of a problem to come out here in the dark and cut her fence. She repaired the rope. Double lashed it this time, then added a third layer with a different knot configuration. She reinforced the 2 weakest posts while she was at it. Then she went inside and ate dried beans for breakfast and thought about what she knew. What she knew was this. Raven's Hollow was not just unwanted land anymore. Somewhere between her purchase and Elias's visit and Silas's displeasure, it had become something else. A statement, a refusal. And some people, when refused, get creative about persuasion. She was not going to leave. That was the thing. The important thing, the load-bearing fact at the center of everything else. She was not going to leave. Not because of pride exactly, though there was some of that. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But because she had looked at this place and seen what it could be, and she had been right, and being right about something on your own terms after everyone has told you you're wrong is the kind of thing that tends to make a person stubborn in ways they didn't know they were capable of. The cut rope had been meant to frighten her. What it had done instead was make the next part simple. She wasn't just surviving out here anymore. She was proving something. And whoever had come out here in the dark had just made sure she wasn't going to stop until she'd finished proving it. She repaired that fence in silence, and she did not mention it to anyone. That was a choice, a deliberate one. She thought about riding back to Red Hollow and telling Elias what she'd found, the clean-cut rope, the specific angle of the cut that told her it had been done with a good knife, not a cheap one. But she stopped herself before she got to the part where she imagined what Elias would say, or what he could do about it, or how that conversation would end. It would end with him looking worried and her looking like someone who needed help and couldn't manage alone. And the truth was she couldn't entirely manage alone, but she needed people to believe she could for a while longer yet, because the belief itself was a kind of protection she couldn't afford to lose. So she kept it to herself. She filed it away in the same place she'd been filing things since Thomas died, the part of her that was keeping track, quietly, of everything that was happening and what it meant and what she intended to do about it eventually. She reinforced the enclosure, added a secondary rope line along the bottom of the posts where an animal, or a person, might try to pull one free. She started sleeping lighter, which she hadn't thought was possible given how tired she was. But the body is more adaptable than the mind gives it credit for. And Bracken helped. He had a low, specific growl he used for things that weren't right, different from his general nighttime restlessness. And she trained herself to wake at that sound, even from the deepest sleep. November came in cold and getting colder. The work shifted. There was less building now and more fortifying, which felt different, less like creating and more like bracing. She spent 3 days rechecking every section of the sheep enclosure, every lashing, every post, looking for weakness, not from sabotage this time, but from the simple structural honesty of rough materials under stress. 2 posts she replaced entirely. She cut the new timber herself, from the eastern slope where the pines were dense enough that the wind hadn't stunted them, and she dragged the logs back alone because Bracken, for all his qualities, was not built for hauling. Her left shoulder started aching somewhere in the second week of November. Not the ache of regular tiredness. She knew that ache, had made a kind of peace with it, but a deeper thing, a grinding that came from the socket and radiated down to the elbow. She had pulled something, hauling timber, and she knew it, and there was nothing to do about it except work through it, so she adjusted how she carried things and kept going. One morning she woke to find the barrel under the cave wall gutter was full. Actually full, for the first time since she'd set it up. She stood and looked at it for a moment with her arms crossed in the cold of the cave, the sheep noise behind her, and Bracken sniffing at the barrel's edge. And she thought, it's working. The rock is weeping, and I caught it. I built something that caught it. The feeling that came with that thought was not triumph. It was quieter than triumph. It was closer to the feeling of finding your footing on unstable ground. Not joy exactly, but solid, the sense that the next step can be taken. She needed that feeling because the cold was getting serious now. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in a single night in the third week of November, and Mara lay in her cabin and listened to the wind come off the ridge and hit the limestone face outside and felt the difference between outside and inside her walls with the attentiveness of someone whose life was depending on the distinction. The woolen clay walls were holding. The stove was drawing correctly, had been drawing correctly for 2 weeks now, and the cabin was warm. Not warm the way a proper house with seasoned wood and fitted windows is warm, but warm enough. Survivably warm. She had learned to read the cave differently by now. After 6 weeks of living in it, the place had started to have a kind of grammar she understood. The way the sound changed when weather was coming, a particular low resonance in the deeper passages, almost below hearing, that she'd come to associate with pressure changes outside. The way the sheep settled differently when the temperature was about to drop versus when it was about to rise. The specific quality of the drip from the gutter wall, which increased slightly before rain and decreased in hard frost, which told her things the sky outside sometimes didn't bother to say until it was too late. She was thinking about all of this one afternoon when she heard a horse on the ridge path. Not Elias this time. The horse moved differently, heavier, more deliberate. And there was a second horse, she realized, listening, a second set of hoofbeats slightly behind the first. She came out of the cave and stood at the mouth and waited. Silas Vance came around the last bend of the path on a big gray gelding with one of his ranch hands, a young man named Cord, who had the particular quality of blankness that some men cultivate when they work for powerful people and need to pretend they're not thinking their own thoughts, trailing behind him. Silas looked at Raven's Hollow the way he looked at most things, assessingly. The expression of a man doing inventory. He looked at the cave mouth, the rough cabin, the sheep pen visible inside, the barrel and gutter system. He looked at all of it, and his face did nothing in particular, which Mara had learned was more informative than if he'd reacted outright. Mara, he said. He didn't get down off the horse. Silas, you've been out here 6 weeks. About that. He turned the gelding slightly, looking at the enclosure angle, the cabin position, doing the geometry. You build all this yourself? Yes. He made the sound in the back of his throat that she remembered from the dinner table, the sound that meant he was revising a number somewhere in his internal accounting and wasn't pleased about the revision. I came to make you an offer. I figured, $40 for the land and whatever livestock you've got. He said it the way you'd say a price for a bolt of cloth. Level. Reasonable sounding on purpose. That's double what you paid. You'd walk away clear. Mara looked at him. She looked at the gray gelding's flank, the careful way Cord was not looking at her. She looked back at Silas. No, she said. He didn't react. 50 then. I'm trying to be fair. You're not trying to be fair, she said. You're trying to solve a problem. Those are different things. Something moved through his expression then. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder than anger. The recalibration of a man who has underestimated a variable and is trying not to show that he's noticed. The winter's going to be bad, he said. You don't have the resources to... I know what the winter's going to be, she said. I've been preparing for it. You're a woman alone with 10 sheep in a cave. Yes, she said. And? He looked at her for a long moment. The gelding shifted. Cord found something interesting to study on the far ridge. And nothing's going to go wrong between now and spring, Silas said. You're that confident. I'm not confident, she said, but I'm not leaving. He pulled the gelding around. No more offer. No theatrical anger. No raised voice. That wasn't Silas's way, and she'd always found his particular brand of cold displeasure harder to navigate than outright fury because there was nothing to push back against. He just left. Cord followed without a word. The sound of the horses faded down the ridge. Mara stood at the cave mouth until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she went back inside and checked the stove draft and tried to remember if she'd counted the nails she had left and how many she'd need to shore up the secondary post on the north side of the enclosure. She thought about the rope. The cut rope, 3 weeks ago. She thought about Cord's face, the way he hadn't met her eyes. She filed it away. She kept working. The cougar came on a Thursday night, or that was her best guess. She'd lost track of the day of the week sometime around the 4th week out here, And the days had started running together in the way they do when your life is organized around tasks instead of calendars. The important thing was that it was night, full dark, and the sheep were making noise that was different from their regular nighttime noise. And Bracken wasn't growling so much as vibrating, a low, sustained tension through his entire body that she'd never felt in him before. She came awake fast. That was another thing living alone had done to her. Stolen the slow, gradual kind of waking and replaced it with something more immediate, almost like a switch. She sat up and had her hand axe in her hand before she was fully conscious of reaching for it. The sheep noise was escalating, short, sharp, panicked calls. She came out of the cabin into the cave and immediately saw what Bracken had been telling her. The sheep were packed into the far corner of the enclosure, a dense knot of wool and skittish eyes. And at the enclosure's edge, visible even in the dim glow of the banked fire from her stove, was the cougar. It was big. Bigger than she'd thought cougars got, though she'd never been this close to one, which put some limits on her reference points. It was moving along the rope line of the enclosure, testing it, looking for a way in. It moved beautifully, which she noticed even though the noticing seemed like a strange priority. The particular fluid economy of a predator that has done this before and knows how to do it and is being patient about doing it correctly. Mara stood very still. Bracken was next to her, pressed against her leg, that whole body vibration still going, and she put her hand on his back and pressed down slightly. Stay, and felt him hold. She looked at the cougar, she looked at the enclosure, she looked at the cave walls around her, and she thought about what she'd noticed weeks ago about the acoustics. She had noticed it first by accident, talking to Bracken in the deeper part of the cave where her voice had bounced back to her in a strange, doubled way that made even ordinary words sound larger than they were. She'd tested it deliberately after that, clapped her hands, hit a rock against the wall, listened to the way the cave took the sound and amplified and scattered it simultaneously, creating something that didn't come from any single point but seemed to come from everywhere. She looked at the iron pots hanging near the stove. She looked at the cougar, which had found a section of rope that interested it and was working at the lower edge with one paw. She picked up both iron pots. She moved to the section of cave wall she'd identified as the best acoustic point, the back left corner, where the ceiling curved in a specific way, where the geometry of the space created a natural amplification she'd never seen, discussed, or explained, just felt, empirically, through weeks of living inside it. She moved quickly and quietly, and the cougar hadn't seen her yet, was still focused on the rope. She got to the wall. She looked at the enclosure one more time. Margaret was at the center of the sheep knot, which was either leadership or cowardice, and in sheep, those were not always distinguishable. Mara Vance slammed the two iron pots together with everything she had. The sound that came out of that cave was not the sound of two iron pots. That was not what the cave produced. What the cave produced was something vast and metallic and directionless, a wave of sound that hit every wall simultaneously and came back from all of them at once, a roar that had no single source and therefore no logic for any creature trying to locate it or escape it. It was the sound of something much larger than a woman with two pots. It was the sound of a threat with no visible shape. The cougar left. There was no other word for it. Then it didn't prowl away, didn't retreat with dignity. It simply left, instantly, a flash of tawny movement past the cave mouth, and then nothing, just the echo dying in the limestone and the sound of the sheep, still panicked but alive. And Bracken's low exhale beside her knee. Mara lowered the pots. Her hands were shaking. That was fine, they could shake. She checked the enclosure thoroughly. The section the cougar had been working at had a frayed lower edge on one rope, but nothing compromised. She reinforced it anyway, by lamplight, because she was not going to sleep again tonight without knowing it was solid. She worked through the shaking in her hands by working through it, which is the only way. When she was done, she sat on the ground just inside the cave mouth with her back against the limestone and Bracken beside her, and she thought about the sound she'd made. She had known the acoustics were there. She had filed that information away the way she filed everything away, not knowing exactly when it would be useful, just knowing that information tends to be useful eventually if you hold on to it long enough. She had not planned the cougar. She had not rehearsed the pots. She had just known her own cave well enough to use it. That was something. She sat there until the sky outside began to lighten, and then she got up and started another day. 2 days later, Elias came up the ridge again. He tied his horse at the cave mouth and walked around the outside of the enclosure with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at things. Then he came inside and looked at the cabin and the stove and the barrel and the gutter system, and he did all of this without saying anything, which Mara was beginning to understand was his version of being impressed. "I heard there was a cougar on this ridge," he said finally. "Pete Rourke found tracks." It came to the enclosure. He looked at her. "What happened?" She told him about the pots and the acoustics. She said it plainly, without dramatizing it, because it didn't need dramatizing. The plain version was already strange enough. He listened without interrupting. "You figured that out yourself?" he said when she was done. "The sound thing? I noticed how the cave carried sound when I got here. I just remembered it when I needed it." Elias was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the cave ceiling, the curve of it, the way the shape of the place worked. "I've sold supplies to homesteaders for 20 years, he said slowly, as if he was working this out while saying it. "Most of them come in here thinking about what the land can give them, soil and water and timber." He paused. "You think about what it already is." She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. "Silas was in the store again," he said. "Was he?" "He's asking around about whether there are other parcels adjacent to Raven's Hollow, talking to the land office." Elias looked at her steadily. "He can't take what you own, but he could make it inconvenient if he puts pressure on access roads or water rights farther down the ridge." Mara thought about this. She hadn't thought about the access road. She filed it away. "Can he do that? Legally?" "Depends on the language in your deed. I drew it up fast. I can look at it again if you want." "I want," she said. He nodded, pulled out a small paper sack and set it on the cabin floor. More beans, a paper of salt, 2 small candles that she hadn't asked for and was intensely grateful for. He didn't make it into anything, just set it down. "The water's still coming?" he asked, looking at the barrel. "Every day, more when it rains, less in hard frost, but it doesn't stop." He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief. In the way of a man recalibrating, again, the distance between what he'd expected and what was actually here. "Mara, that water system, it's not a system," she said. "It's a barrel and some bent metal." "It's a system," he said firmly. "I've seen homesteaders spend more money and less thought on water than you have on that wall. You found a solution that doesn't depend on weather or outside supply." He paused. "You understand how rare that is out here?" She understood. She had always understood it. She had just not expected anyone else to. He left before noon. She watched him ride down the ridge and she thought about what he'd said, the distinction he'd drawn between what land can give you and what it already is. It felt important in a way she couldn't quite articulate yet. She spent the afternoon checking her firewood supply, which was less than she wanted it to be. She had been cutting and stacking steadily, but she'd lost 4 days to the worst of her shoulder pain, and the woodpile showed it. She went back to it now, working with the careful mechanical patience she'd developed for tasks that would take a long time and just had to be gotten through. She was cutting when she heard the sound. Not hoofbeats this time. Footsteps. One person, on foot, coming up the path from the direction of Red Hollow. She lowered the axe and watched. The woman who came around the bend was older than Mara, mid-40s probably, with a weathered face and the posture of someone who'd spent a lot of years working outdoors and had stopped apologizing for it. She was carrying a covered pot, and she walked with a slight hitch in her left stride that spoke of an old injury. She looked at Mara across the clearing and stopped. "You're Mara Vance," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Ruth Garfield." She held up the pot. "I live down on the East Fork. My husband worked for Silas Vance for 6 years before Silas shorted him on a 3-month contract and he quit." She said this the way you'd state a weather condition, flat, factual, without particular heat, though the heat was there underneath. "I've been hearing about you from Elias. I thought I'd come see for myself." She looked around at the cave, the enclosure, the cabin walls. "You really built all this since September?" "October," Mara said. "End of September." Ruth looked at the cabin walls, the clay and moss construction, the wool-packed joints. She walked to the enclosure and looked at the posts and the lashing. She walked to the barrel and looked at the gutter system for a long time, her head slightly tilted. "Where'd you learn that?" she said, pointing at the gutter. "I didn't learn it. I worked it out." Ruth turned and looked at her with an expression that Mara had seen from almost nobody in Red Hollow, except Elias on his better days. The expression of someone who was actually seeing her, not the version of her they'd already decided on. "I've got a stew," Ruth said. "Beef and root vegetables. I made too much." She said this in a tone that suggested she had made exactly the right amount and had walked it up a ridge in the cold on purpose. "Thank you," Mara said, and meant it more than she'd meant most things recently. They ate inside the cabin. It was crowded with 2 people and a dog, and the stew was better than anything Mara had eaten in 6 weeks. And they talked for 2 hours in the unsentimental, practical way that women on the frontier sometimes talk when they're not performing anything for anyone, about winter preparations and livestock and soil chemistry and the specific character of Silas Vance's particular variety of land acquisition, which Ruth had opinions about that she expressed with the efficiency of long, confirmed suspicion. "He's not going to stop at one offer," Ruth said, scraping the bottom of her bowl with the single-mindedness of a woman who didn't waste food. "He came after our place the year after my husband quit on him. Different methods, same idea. He likes to own what's near him." She looked at Mara. "What are you going to do if he comes back with something worse than an offer?" "I don't know yet," Mara said, "but I'm not leaving." Ruth looked at her. She had dark eyes that were direct in a way Mara appreciated. "Most people say that right up until they do," she said. Not unkindly, just honestly. "I know," Mara said, "but I found the water. I built the walls. That cougar came and I scared it off with the cave itself." She paused. "I'm not leaving because I'm starting to understand this place, and it's starting to work." Ruth considered that. She picked up her pot. At the cave mouth, she stopped and turned around. "I'll come back in 2 weeks," she said, "if the weather holds." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Ruth looked at her steadily. "I want to see how you're getting on." She walked back down the ridge. Mara watched her go and then went back into the cave and checked the stove and sat on the edge of her sleeping pallet and felt something she hadn't entirely felt since she walked away from the Vance property. Not safe. She wasn't safe. She understood that clearly, but not entirely alone either. She sat with that for a minute. Then she checked the firewood and did the mental arithmetic on how many more cutting days she needed before the big weather came. And she tried to work out whether she could add a secondary barrier around the sheep enclosure before the first real freeze. And she fell asleep somewhere in the middle of that calculation, sitting up, with Bracken's head on her foot. December arrived and announced itself. The temperature dropped in a way that was different from November's cold. This wasn't practicing anymore. This was the thing itself. Mara had read winters before, had known cold, but the northern ridge exposure was a different animal than valley cold, less relentless but more vicious in its peaks, the kind of cold that didn't care about your preparations and would tell you, very directly, which ones had been adequate. Her preparations mostly had been adequate. Mostly. The woodpile was short. She was burning it down faster than she'd calculated because the shoulder had cost her, and she had to be careful with the stove drafting to maximize heat output from less wood, which meant adjusting the damper more frequently than she'd like, and waking at intervals in the night to add fuel. She was sleeping in 4-hour blocks and working the rest. Her hands were cracked from the cold and the clay work and the rope handling, and she'd used the last of the small amount of rendered fat she'd brought for healing them, so she was just living with the cracks now. The sheep were doing better than she, honestly. The cave temperature in the enclosed section was stable in a way the outside world absolutely was not, and the animals had settled into a routine placidity that told her they felt safe, which she found disproportionately comforting given that she was the one who'd built the thing keeping them safe. She was inside the cabin one morning, recalculating wood supply against the number of days until the worst of winter should logically break, when Bracken made the low, specific growl. She was out of the cabin and at the cave mouth in seconds. Cord was standing 50 feet from the cave entrance, just standing there, alone, no horse visible, which meant he'd tied it somewhere down the path and walked up. He had his hands visible, not in his coat, a deliberate posture. I was looking at the cave. When he saw her, he didn't move. He said, "I'm not here for trouble." "Then why are you here?" A pause. He was young, maybe 22, 23, with a kind of angular discomfort about him that suggested someone who spent a lot of time not saying what he was thinking. "I came to tell you something," he said. "Something I probably shouldn't be telling you." Mara looked at him. She looked at the tree line. She looked back at him. "Tell me from there," she said. He shifted. "The rope," he said. "3 weeks ago. On your enclosure." She felt something go very still inside her. I did it, Cord said. Silas told me to come out here at night, and he didn't say cut, exactly. He said make it difficult. He said if one or two of the sheep got out in the cold, you'd likely pack up and come back. He said this in the flat tone of someone reciting something they'd memorized, maybe because it was easier to say that way. I used my knife. Just the one section. Mara said nothing. I'm not working for him anymore, Cord said. As of last week. He stiffed me on a month of wages because I told him I wasn't going back out here again. He looked at the ground briefly, then back up. I thought you should know it was deliberate, and I thought you should know he's not done. What does that mean? Mara asked. Not done. Cord's jaw moved. He was working up to something. He's been talking to a man named Aldrich who does, I don't know exactly what he does. He finds ways to make things happen that the law can't point back to. I don't know what he's planning specifically. I just know he's talking to that man, and it's about Raven's Hollow. He looked at her steadily. I thought you deserved to know. The wind came off the ridge. Mara felt it against her face. Why are you telling me? She asked. Really? Cord was quiet for a moment. Because I came out here in the dark and cut your fence, he said. And when I rode back, I kept thinking about the fact that you've got 10 sheep and a dog, and you're out here alone and it's going to be winter, and I cut your fence. He said the last part like it was an object he was turning over. It didn't sit right. Mara looked at him for a long time. He didn't look away. The angular discomfort was still there, but underneath it was something else. Not remorse exactly, more like a person who has done a balance sheet on themselves and come up short and is trying to decide what to do about the deficit. All right, she said finally. Cord nodded. He pulled his coat tighter. I'm sorry, he said. For the fence. She didn't tell him it was all right, because it wasn't, and she didn't think he needed to be told that it was. Thank you for coming, she said instead, for telling me. He walked back down the path. Mara stood at the cave mouth and listened to the wind and thought about a man named Aldrich and what make things happen meant in practical terms, and what her options were in response to a threat she couldn't see the shape of yet. She thought about Ruth. She thought about Elias and the deed language. She thought about the cave itself, the walls she'd built inside it, the water she'd caught off the limestone, the acoustics she'd used to drive off a predator. She thought about every problem she'd solved out here by looking at what was actually there instead of what she'd been told she'd find. Silas Vance had power. That was real. He had money and connections and a history of getting what he wanted through methods that kept his hands clean. He was not going to come at her directly. He was going to come at her in ways that were hard to name. But she was still here. That was also real. She was still here, and the water was still coming off the wall, and the sheep were still alive, and the walls were still standing. And the winter, the worst winter in 20 years, by Elias's accounting and Ruth's and the geese formations that Bill Rourke had been watching, was still coming. She looked up at the sky. It had turned the particular color in the past hour that she'd started to recognize. A flat, characterless gray that wasn't quite threatening yet but was making up its mind. She went inside. She added wood to the stove. She checked the water barrel. She checked the enclosure, every post and every lashing. The section cord had cut, and she'd reinforced twice over. She brought in an extra armload of wood and stacked it inside the cabin door where it would stay dry. Then she sat down on her pallet and looked at her hands, cracked and raw and capable, more capable than she'd known before all of this. And she thought about what came next. The gray sky was making up its mind. So was she. The gray sky made up its mind on a Wednesday. Mara knew it was coming before it came, not because of any particular instinct or gift, just because she'd been paying attention for 2 months, and attention, sustained and honest, will eventually tell you things. The cave had been making that low resonance she'd learned to associate with pressure change. The sheep had been restless in the specific way they got restless before weather, not the sharp panic of the cougar night, but a generalized unease, a collective shifting and settling that meant the air itself was telling them something. And the sky that morning had the color of old pewter, flat and heavy and purposeful. She had 1 day, maybe less. She had been preparing for this since October, and she had known the preparation was incomplete, and now the incomplete preparation was going to meet the actual winter, and she was going to find out which parts held and which parts didn't, with no opportunity to fix the ones that didn't before she had to live inside the consequences. That was the honest summary of her situation. She had learned to keep her summaries honest. She spent the morning moving. Not frantically. Frantic is inefficient, and she couldn't afford inefficiency. But with the focused speed of someone working through a mental list that had been assembled and revised over weeks. Extra wood inside, all of it she could carry, stacked against the cabin's interior north wall, where the temperature was most stable. The water barrel was full. She'd topped it yesterday from the limestone drip and from a bucket run to the rain pool before it could freeze over. And she checked the gutter, lashing one more time, and added a secondary attachment point at the top. The sheep enclosure. She went around the entire perimeter, every post, every rope, every knot. She found one lashing on the south side that had worked slightly loose in the cold, and she tightened it until her fingers went numb, and then she tightened it once more. She was on her third circuit of the enclosure when she heard hoofbeats. Not Elias's horse, not the deliberate heaviness of Silas's gelding, something faster, more urgent. She came to the cave mouth and saw Ruth Garfield riding up the path at a pace that was not Ruth's usual methodical uphill plod, and she knew before Ruth pulled the horse up and said anything that something had happened. "Aldrich," Ruth said, breathing hard. She'd ridden fast and the horse was blowing. "I was in town yesterday evening, talking to Pete Rourke about water rights on the North Ridge access." Mara felt the cold come into her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Can he do anything before the storm?" "I don't know." Elias said he's seen Aldrich's type work through paperwork at the land office, filing challenges, challenging deed language. Nothing illegal exactly, just— Ruth stopped. Legal enough to cause problems, long enough to drain your money fighting it. She looked at the sky. "Storm's coming today." "I know." Ruth looked at her. "I can't stay," she said. "I've got my own animals to get in." She reached into her coat and pulled out a paper-wrapped package. "I brought salted pork, and—" She hesitated, like she was deciding something. "I told Elias about Aldrich. He said he'd pull your deed language today and have a look. He has a copy." She paused again. "He's on your side, Mara. He doesn't say things like that, but he is." Mara took the package. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Get your animals settled." Ruth turned the horse, stopped, looked back over her shoulder. "The cave is going to hold," she said. It came out less like encouragement and more like a statement of observed fact, which was why it mattered. "I've looked at those walls. That place is going to hold." She rode down the ridge at the same pace she'd come up. Mara stood with the salted pork in her hands and listened to the hoofbeats fade, and then listened to the wind, which was changing in a way she could feel in her ears, a deepening of the pressure that meant the atmosphere itself was rearranging. She went back inside, back to work. By afternoon, the sky had dropped. That was the only way to describe it. The cloud ceiling came down like something overhead had given up the distance between itself and the ground, and the light went flat and strange. The particular colorless quality that comes before heavy snow, when the sun is blocked by enough cloud that even the shadows disappear. Everything looked the same shade of nothing. Mara had the stove burning at the level she'd calculated. Not maximum, not yet, because she needed the wood to last, and maximum heat now meant insufficient heat in 4 days when she needed it more. And the cabin was holding temperature. She sat on her pallet with Bracken beside her and did what she did when there was nothing left to do but wait, which was to go back through everything in her head. The firewood would last 8 days at current burn rate. She had provisions for 3 weeks. The water barrel was full, and the limestone drip would continue regardless of surface weather. She'd already confirmed this, or as close to confirmed as she could get, by noting that the drip didn't change during the hardest frosts of November, only slowed. The sheep enclosure was solid. The cabin walls had passed every cold night she'd thrown at them. And she had a name, Aldrich. She had the shape of the threat, even if she didn't have its face yet. She was still thinking when the first snow started. It came in the late afternoon, just as the light was failing. A fine, driven snow at first, the kind that feels almost gentle until you're in it long enough to understand it's not being gentle, it's just small. The wind came with it from the north-northwest, which was the direction she'd been most worried about in relation to the cave mouth orientation. She'd thought about this when she chose the cabin placement, had walked the cave mouth at different times of day in different winds trying to understand which direction the worst exposure came from. The cave mouth faced south-southeast, which meant the north-northwest wind hit the limestone face at an angle that deflected most of it past the opening rather than driving it in. She watched the snow start from the cave mouth. Bracken sat beside her, his shoulder pressed against her leg, and they stood there together for a while watching the world go white. "All right," she said. They went inside. The first night was manageable. The snow was heavy, but the wind had a consistent direction, and the cave held its temperature with the stubbornness of solid rock. She slept in 2-hour intervals, waking to check the stove and listen to the sheep and feel the air temperature with the thermometer she'd constructed from a bottle of fluid and a notched stick. Not precise, but comparative, which was what she needed. The cabin was warmer at 2 in the morning than it had been at midnight. The walls were working. The sheep were quiet. That meant more to her than the temperature reading. Animals that are genuinely stressed do not settle into quiet, and her sheep were quiet. By morning, the snow was serious. She could tell without going outside, or rather, she could tell by the way the quality of light at the cave mouth had changed, the snow having built up into a configuration outside that altered the diffusion of whatever gray daylight existed. She pulled on every layer she owned, which was not as many layers as she would have liked, and went to the cave mouth and looked out. The world had changed shape. The ridge that she'd walked every day for 2 months was gone. Not blocked. Gone. Subsumed into a uniform white that had erased every landmark she'd been using to organize her sense of direction. The path down to Red Hollow, the eastern pine slope, the limestone outcropping she used as a bearing when she went for timber. All of it was under snow that was already thigh-deep in the open areas and building continuously, driven by a wind that had picked up overnight and was now operating with a kind of mindless, purposeful violence that made the cougar seem, by comparison, almost reasonable. She did not need to go out. That was the thing she came back to, again and again, over the next 3 days. She did not need to go out. The water was inside, the food was inside, the wood was inside, the sheep were inside, and the sheep were the whole point. This had been her theory when she looked at this cave in the autumn light and felt the possibility of it, that the right shelter meant not having to fight the weather every day just to survive it. She hadn't been sure the theory was right until now, standing at the cave mouth watching the storm and understanding, with the particular relief of a bet paying off, that she didn't have to go into that. She made herself useful inside instead. She checked the enclosure 3 times a day, not because she thought something would fail, but because checking kept her honest about whether something was going to fail before it did rather than after. She inventoried her wood daily, calculating the rate of burn and the expected duration of the storm and whether the math was holding. She kept the stove at the level she'd planned and resisted the urge to push it higher when the cave got cold in the early mornings, which it did, dropping to a temperature that was genuinely uncomfortable and required her to move, to keep blood in her extremities, to do push-ups against the cabin wall if nothing else was available. Not because she was a person who did push-ups, she had not been that person before any of this, but because the alternative was letting the cold into her body, and she had learned that cold in the body is the first version of a problem that has worse subsequent versions. On the second day, she found that one of her ewes, a younger one, the smallest of the 10, the one she'd never named because Thomas had warned her once against naming sheep you might have to sell, was not eating. Sheep that stop eating are a problem. She knew that much without knowing much about sheep medicine. She went into the enclosure and crouched by the ewe and ran her hands over the animal's neck and jaw and down her sides, looking for the thing you look for when you don't exactly know what you're looking for, but you're looking anyway. The ew's temperature felt high. Not catastrophically high, but elevated. She was hunching slightly, which might be cold or might be discomfort from somewhere internal. Mara sat in the enclosure for a while. The snow continued outside. The other 9 sheep milled around her in the peculiarly unconcerned way sheep have even in the presence of difficulty, because sheep do not waste emotional energy on problems that aren't immediately theirs. She couldn't take the ewe to a doctor. There was no reaching Red Hollow in this. She couldn't call for help. There was no help available. She could keep the animal warm, which the cave was already doing. She could make sure it had clean water, which she did, bringing a portion of her barrel supply into the enclosure in a low pan. She could watch it. That was the available medicine. Watch it, keep it warm, keep it watered, and hope the thing resolving itself one way resolved itself the other way. She named the ewe. She named her Frances. She wasn't sure why that name exactly. It had come to her sitting in the cold enclosure looking at this small animal that might die and might not. and naming her felt like the honest thing to do, the thing that acknowledged that she cared about the outcome and was done pretending she didn't. She went back to the cabin. She checked the stove. She ate salted pork and beans that she'd been carefully rationing and thought about Aldrich and what he might be filing at the land office, and whether Elias had looked at the deed language yet, and whether there was a legal argument about water rights that could actually restrict her access to the path. She could do about it in the middle of a blizzard. And thinking about things you can't do anything about in the middle of a blizzard is a specific kind of stupid that she was trying to train herself away from. She thought about Thomas instead. She didn't do that often. She was careful about it, actually. The way you're careful with something that has a lot of weight and you're not sure of your footing. But in the second night of the storm, with the wind audible even through the limestone and the stove ticking and Bracken pressed against her side, she let herself think about him. He had known, she thought. Not consciously, maybe, not in a planned way, but he had known what he was giving her when he registered those sheep in her name. He had grown up with Silas, and he understood, better than anyone, what Silas did with things he considered his. Thomas had put something outside of that, something that could only belong to her, and he'd done it years before either of them had any reason to think it would matter. She wondered if he'd known something was coming. Probably not. He'd been 28 and healthy, and the fever had been genuinely unexpected. But she thought about the gesture itself, the way he'd handed her the paperwork and said, half laughing, half serious, "These are yours, you understand, not mine, not the ranch's, yours." And she had laughed too and said she understood and put the paperwork away and thought about it maybe twice in the years since. She thought about it now. "Thank you," she said quietly. To the cave, to the air, to the pocket watch she still carried, to whatever version of Thomas existed in the space where the people you've lost continue to exist, which she had no theology for and didn't need one. Bracken shifted against her. She put her hand on his back. The storm continued. On the morning of the third day, Mara woke to something different. Silence. Not the silence of a cave at night, which always has textures, the settling of rock, the breathing of animals, the minute sounds of weather at a distance. This was a different quality of silence. The kind of silence that happens when something that has been making a great deal of noise has stopped. She lay still for a moment, making sure she was interpreting it correctly. Then she got up. The cave mouth was half blocked. Snow had built up against the limestone face and drifted partially across the opening, leaving a gap about 4 feet wide that admitted a pale, white-gray light that was different from the storm light, brighter, directional, the light of reflected sun on snow, which meant there was sun, which meant the storm was over. She stood at the blocked mouth and looked through the gap at the world outside and felt something move through her that she couldn't name exactly. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief. Not quite. It was something quieter than both of those, the feeling of having made a claim about what was possible and had the world confirm it. She checked the sheep first. All 10 of them alive. Francis was standing, which she hadn't been certain about. The ew's temperature felt normal when Mara ran her hands along the animal's sides, and she was eating, tentatively, without enthusiasm, but eating, which was the thing that mattered. She would need watching, but she was standing and eating in a cave that had just held through 3 days of the worst storm in 20 years, and that was enough for right now. Mara went back to the cave mouth. She spent 2 hours moving snow from the entrance with the flat-bottom wooden shovel she'd made from a split log and a handle cut from a pine branch. Not efficient, exactly, but adequate, which was the standard she'd stopped being embarrassed by, and opened the mouth wide enough to move through freely. She stepped outside. The world was white. Deeply, extravagantly, almost insultingly white. The snow had reshaped everything into a smooth, continuous surface that bore no relationship to the landscape she'd been living in for 2 months. The ridge was buried. The path was gone. The eastern pines were bent under snow weight in a way that made them look like they were bowing to something. She stood in it and looked around. In the distance, she couldn't see Red Hollow from here. The ridge blocked the sight line, but she knew the direction. She could hear nothing. No bells. No voices. No sounds of livestock or labor. Just the particular absolute quiet of a frontier town buried under snow that was, by her estimation, 4 feet deep in the open and considerably more in the drifted sections. She thought about the ranchers on the flats south of town. The families with barns that had been standing for 10 or 15 years, wood-frame structures built to hold what the average winter could throw at them. The Rourke place. The Harmon family. Silas Vance's property with its large main barn and secondary outbuildings. She thought about what 4 feet of snow and 3 days of sustained high wind loading did to a wood-framed barn. She went back inside. She fed the sheep. She ate breakfast. She checked the water. The limestone drip was continuing, had continued through the entire storm, which she took a moment to appreciate before moving on to the next thing. Then she sat down with a piece of charcoal and the back of a paper bag she'd been using as a record sheet, and she wrote down what she had. 10 sheep, all alive. Full water barrel. 6 days of firewood remaining. 2 weeks of provisions. A cabin with walls that had held. A stove that was drawing correctly. A cave mouth she could now clear and move through. She wrote it down because she wanted to see it. The actual count of what she had. Not what she was supposed to have or what she'd hoped she'd have. What she actually had. She stared at that list for a long time. Then she heard something outside that made her put the charcoal down and stand up. A voice. Distant, coming from down the ridge. She couldn't make out words yet, just the quality of a human voice. Male, calling out. Then a second voice, also male. Then the sound of movement through snow, heavy and slow. She went to the cave mouth. 2 men were coming up the ridge. She didn't recognize them at first because they were bundled to the point of shapelessness, wrapped in every layer they owned, plowing through the deep snow with the effortful seriousness of people who had been walking for a while and were not enjoying it. The one in front was carrying something, a bag, she thought, heavy from the way he was managing it. They got close enough that she recognized them. Pete Rourke, one of the ranchers whose place was 2 miles south, and his older son Danny. Pete was 40-something, and Danny was maybe 17, and they both looked like the storm had found them personally offensive. Pete stopped about 30 feet out and looked at the cave and what he could see of the enclosure through the mouth, and the sheep moving around inside, and Mara standing at the entrance with Bracken beside her. He said nothing for a moment, just looked. "Your animals make it," he said finally. "All of them," she said. "Yours?" His face did something complicated. "Lost 6 sheep. North corner of the barn roof came in." He said it the way people say things when they're still slightly in shock about them, factually, with the emotion running just underneath the facts. "Old barn. I knew the ridge beam was suspect." He shook his head. "How's your water?" "I've got a full barrel, and the limestone is still dripping," she said. "I could spare some if you need." Pete looked at the barrel and the gutter system visible just inside the cave mouth. He looked at it for a moment with an expression she recognized as the same one Elias had worn and Ruth had worn. The recalibration expression, the math coming out different from what had been expected. "That's your own system," he said. "You built that." "Yes." "And it ran through the whole storm." "Yes." Danny was looking at the sheep enclosure. He was young enough that he hadn't yet developed the layer of assumption that adults build up. So he was just looking at it plainly, assessing it with the direct curiosity of someone who sees something that worked and wants to understand why. "How deep is the enclosure set?" he asked. 8 feet into the cave, Mara said. "Far enough that the wind doesn't reach it." He nodded slowly. He was counting the sheep, she realized, running his eyes around the enclosure doing an actual count. "All 10, she confirmed. Something moved through Danny's expression that his father's didn't show yet. Something that was going to take a while to become anything specific, but that was moving in the direction of respect. Pete reached into his coat and came out with a folded piece of paper. He held it out. "Elias asked me to bring this up if I could get through," he said. "Said it was important." She took it. The paper was damp at the edges from the snow, but the writing inside was intact. She recognized Elias's compact, careful handwriting. She read it standing there. He had looked at the deed. The language was clear on the land boundaries, but there was a section, one paragraph, written in the kind of legal language that was designed to be technical enough to dispute, about access to the Northern Ridge path, the path she used daily to come and go from Red Hollow. The paragraph specified that the path fell within a right-of-way that could, under certain interpretations, be subject to challenge by adjacent landowners. Adjacent landowners. Silas owned the parcels on both sides of the ridge below her. She had not known that when she bought Raven's Hollow. She had not known to check. At the bottom of Elias's letter, in a slightly different hand that was more urgent, less careful, Aldrich filed paperwork with the land office 3 days before the storm. Challenge to your path access. Hearing scheduled in 2 weeks. Come see me when you can get down. Mara folded the paper. She put it in her coat pocket, next to the watch. She looked at Pete Rourke. He had the look of a man who knows something is in a letter and is deciding whether to ask about it. She didn't volunteer it. "Thank you for bringing this," she said. He nodded. "Do you need anything? We've got more than we need right now, and the Harmon family lost their entire flock, 6 head of cattle too, so we're trying to figure out where the need is worst." "I'm all right," she said. "Truly." He believed her. She could see that he believed her, which was different from the version of Red Hollow that had watched her walk north with her dog and her sheep and given her until the first cold snap before she came back. He believed her because the evidence of it was standing in front of him. "Your system," Pete said, again looking at the gutter and the barrel. "The water off the rock." "Yes." "Could that work on other cave formations? We've got a small one on the north end of our property. Never thought to use it for anything." "It depends on the rock composition," Mara said. "Limestone weeps. Not all rock does. But it's worth checking." Pete was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man doing a kind of arithmetic that was not about numbers. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "When you bought this place," he said. "I was in the store, I heard, and I said something to Elias about it that I shouldn't have said." He stopped, looked at her steadily. "I thought you were making a mistake. I thought a woman alone in your situation." He stopped again. He wasn't a man who was good at the middle of sentences that required him to examine himself. "I thought wrong," he said. "That's all." "You're not the only one," Mara said. She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. Because it was a fact, and she'd stopped needing to make people feel worse about it than they already did when they arrived at the moment of correction themselves. Pete nodded. He and Danny made their way back down the ridge, slow and deliberate through the deep snow. Mara watched them until they were out of sight. She went inside. She sat on her pallet and took the letter back out and read it again. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks until the hearing, and she had a challenge to her path access filed by a man she'd never met, on behalf of a man who had sat at her husband's funeral and called himself a father. She had an incomplete deed with a paragraph in it that Elias hadn't caught, and she hadn't known to look for. She felt the anger then. It was not the hot, immediate anger of the moment Silas had slid the watch across the table. It was colder than that, more focused, the kind of anger that has been confirmed repeatedly over a long period of time and has used that confirmation to become something less reactive and more purposeful. She was not going to lose the path. She did not have a lawyer. She did not have money for a lawyer, not serious money, the kind that could fight a land office challenge with an adversary who had more of it. But she had Elias, and Elias knew the deed. And she had 2 weeks in a mind that had built a functional homestead from a limestone cave and a set of practical problems, and legal problems were, at their core, still practical problems. She got up. She checked the stove. She went to the enclosure and checked on Francis, who was eating steadily now, and she stood there for a while in the warmth of the cave with the flock around her and the sound of meltwater beginning to run somewhere outside where the sun was working on the snow. The storm was over. The problem that came after it was already in motion. She began with what she knew. She knew the deed. Elias had a copy and she had the original, and the paragraph about path access was specific enough that there might be counter-language somewhere in the land office records about established right-of-way. The path had existed before she bought the land, had existed before Silas owned his adjacent parcels, and established paths had legal status in the territory if they predated adjacent ownership. She had heard this somewhere, from Thomas, she thought, a conversation about boundary disputes on the Vance property that she'd half listened to and now found herself trying to reconstruct from the fragments. She also knew something about Silas that she had been thinking about since Cord came up the ridge and told her the truth about the fence. Silas had used a man named Aldrich because he couldn't come at her directly without it being visible, and he couldn't have it be visible because Elias was watching and Ruth was watching and Pete Rourke was now, she thought, also watching, at least a little. The people of Red Hollow were not her allies exactly, not yet, but they were watching, and Silas was not the kind of man who operated well under observation. She thought about that quality of his, the clean hands requirement, and she thought about what it meant for the path challenge. If the challenge was filed as a technical land dispute, it would be heard in front of the county land commissioner. The commissioner was not a judge. The commissioner was a man named Harwick, who had been in Red Hollow for 8 years and who, Mara recalled from Thomas's occasional comments, was deeply averse to being in the middle of things. He did not like conflict that had faces attached to it. He liked paperwork that resolved itself clearly on the basis of documentation. She needed documentation. She needed to know how long the path had existed, who had used it, when Silas had acquired his adjacent parcels relative to the path's establishment, whether there were any records, survey records, sale records, anything, that placed the path's use before Silas's ownership. She sat with this for a long time. Then she got up and put on all her layers and took the wooden shovel and went out into the bright, brutal cold of the post-storm world and started digging a path down the ridge toward Red Hollow. Not because she could get there today. She couldn't. The snow was too deep and the distance too far, and she hadn't built her strength back up from 3 days of reduced activity inside the cave. She was digging because the path needed to be cleared, and because physical work had always been the thing that organized her thinking, and because she needed to think clearly about the next 2 weeks, and because the act of digging her way out was the correct metaphor for her situation, and she was the kind of person who found it easier to think when her body was engaged. She dug for 2 hours. She cleared maybe 200 yards of path before her shoulder told her she was done for the day, and she went back inside and ate the last of Ruth's salted pork and drank from the barrel and sat down with the charcoal and the paper bag. She began writing down everything she could remember about the path. When she'd first seen it, what condition it was in when she arrived, worn, established, the kind of path that forms over years of use, not months. Whether she knew of anyone who had used it before her. The 2 previous homesteaders who'd tried Raven's Hollow and given up, they had used the path, presumably. That meant the path predated her ownership, which meant it might predate Silas's adjacent parcels. She wrote it all down. Every detail, every fragment. She wrote until her hand hurt, and then she wrote a little more. Outside, the sun was moving west across a sky that had cleared to a hard, brilliant blue. The kind of blue that only exists after a storm has scoured everything and the cold is deep enough that the air has no moisture left to cloud it. The snow on the ridge was blinding in the afternoon light. Long blue shadows stretched from every drift. Inside the cave, the stove ticked steadily. The sheep were settled. Frances was asleep in the corner, her sides rising and falling with the rhythm of an animal that has decided, apparently, to continue living. Mara looked at what she'd written. She looked at the pocket watch, which she'd set on the cave floor beside her because she'd been reaching for it while she thought, the old habit. She thought about Silas Vance walking into the land office the morning after the storm broke. She thought about him looking at the territory map with his particular expression of inventory. She thought about what he expected to find when the path challenge was heard. A young widow who'd survived the storm, perhaps? Yes. He might be willing to concede that now, but who could not navigate a legal proceeding and would not have the resources to try? He had never, in all the time she'd known him, considered the possibility that he might be wrong about her. That was going to cost him something. She didn't know exactly what yet, but she was going to find out in 2 weeks, in a room she'd never been in, making an argument she hadn't finished constructing, in front of a man who didn't like conflict. She had built a functional homestead out of a cave and a set of practical problems. She added this one to the list and kept working. She spent 4 days digging out before she could make the full walk to Red Hollow. Not 4 days of continuous digging. Her shoulder wouldn't have allowed that even if the logic of it had. She worked the path in sections, 2 hours in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, methodical, starting from the cave and working down the ridge. In the same way she'd approached every other problem out here, one piece at a time, in the order that made structural sense, without wasting energy on frustration about how long it was taking. The cold after the storm was the clear, vicious kind. The sky was brilliant blue every morning, and the temperature was low enough to make the insides of her nostrils feel brittle, and the snow that had seemed soft during the storm had crusted over into something that required the wooden shovel and body weight combined to move. Bracken helped in the way that Bracken helped with most things, which was to say, he ran ahead and came back and communicated urgency without contributing labor. But his presence on the path made the work feel less like solitary confinement, and she was grateful for that in the particular way that she'd become grateful for small things, completely, without irony. On the second day of digging, she found a section of the path that had been cleared already. Coming from the direction of Red Hollow, someone had been working from the bottom up. She stopped and looked at the cleared section and then followed it with her eyes up toward where her own work ended. On the third day, she met Danny Rourke at the midpoint, both of them breathing hard in the cold air, standing in the trench they'd dug toward each other like something from a story about people who were too stubborn to wait to be rescued. Danny looked at her. He was holding the same kind of flatboard shovel she'd made, though his was a real one from the Rourke barn. "Dad sent me up," he said. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Did he say why?" Danny thought about it. "He said you'd need to get to town and the path needed clearing and it might as well get done." He paused. "He also said not to make a thing of it." "Tell him I said thank you." "He said you'd say that and to tell you it wasn't necessary." She almost smiled. It was the most Pete Rourke thing she could imagine him doing. The help and the instruction not to acknowledge the help arriving as a package. "All right," she said. They finished the last stretch together, which took less than an hour with 2 people working, and when the path was clear from the Rourke property's edge all the way to the cave mouth. She shook Danny's hand, which seemed to surprise him, and he went back down toward his family's place. She went back to the cave, checked the sheep, ate, slept. On the 4th morning, she walked to Red Hollow. The town looked like the aftermath of something. The storm had not been gentle here either. 2 buildings on the main street had lost portions of their roof under the snow weight, and the loading area behind the livery was still buried in drifts that nobody had gotten to yet. The people she passed on the street had the look of individuals who have been through something and are still deciding how to feel about the fact that they came out the other side. There was a kind of post-disaster sociability in the air. People stopped each other to compare damage, to report on which neighbors had come through and which hadn't, to do the inventory that communities do after a collective battering. Several of them looked at Mara when she walked past, not the way they'd looked at her in October. That look had been amusement or dismissal, or the particular incuriosity of people who have already made their minds up about a thing. This look was different. This was the look of people who had heard something about her, that she'd made it through, that all 10 sheep had survived, that she'd been at her cave while their barns were losing roofs, and were not quite sure what to do with that information yet. She didn't stop to explain herself. She had never been the type to explain herself, and the storm hadn't changed that. She walked to Elias's store. He was behind the counter, and he looked up when she came in, and his face did something that in another man would have been called relief. In Elias, it looked more like the recalibration settling, the numbers finally matching up. "All 10?" he said. "All 10, she said. Frances had a rough patch in the middle, but she pulled through. "Frances," he repeated. He knew she'd been naming them. "Don't," she said. He didn't. He came around the counter and went to the back shelf and came back with 2 cups of coffee that he'd been keeping on the small iron stove he used to heat the store, and he handed her one, and they sat on the 2 stools he kept near the window that looked out on the street, the way she'd seen him sit with the old ranchers when they came in to talk. She hadn't sat on those stools before. She noticed that. "Tell me about the path challenge," she said. He wrapped both hands around his cup. "Aldrich filed it the morning the storm came in. Probably deliberate timing. Land Office Commissioner tends to process whatever comes in just before a major weather event without as much scrutiny because everyone's distracted." He looked at his coffee. "The challenge cites the deed paragraph about the right-of-way. Claims the path crosses Silas's eastern parcel below the ridge and that there's no documented easement, so it reverts to the parcel owner's discretion." "Does it cross his parcel?" "The path does pass over the edge of what became his eastern parcel, yes. About 200 yards of it at the lower bend." He paused. "The question is when his ownership of that parcel began relative to the path's established use." "And?" Elias set his cup down. He reached under the counter. He'd been prepared for her, she realized, had things pulled out before she arrived, and produced a folded set of papers. He spread them on the counter between them. "Silas bought that eastern parcel 11 years ago," he said. "The path has been in use since at least 14 years ago. I found 3 separate references in old sale records. When the 2 homesteaders tried Raven's Hollow, both before Silas acquired the eastern parcel, the path is described as the established access route, pre-existing use." He looked at her. "That's the argument. The path was in established use before Silas owned the land it crosses. Under territory law, that should constitute a de facto easement." Mara was quiet for a moment, reading the documents he'd laid out. "Should," she said. "Should," he confirmed. Commissioner Harwick is thorough, but he doesn't like complications. If the argument is clean and the documentation is solid, he'll take the simple path. And if Aldrich makes it complicated? Elias was quiet. That's what Aldrich does. He makes things complicated enough that the simple path disappears. She kept reading. The sale records were old, the handwriting cramped and faded in places, but the references were there. The path named as the access route for the northern limestone tract, in documents that predated Silas's purchase of the eastern parcel by 3 years. 3 years was enough. It wasn't ambiguous. The path had existed as established access before the adjacent parcel changed hands. Is there anyone else who can speak to the path's use? She asked. Before Silas. Elias thought. Old Jem Whitley was here before most people. He's in his 80s and he doesn't come into town much since his wife passed, but he's sharp. He remembered both homesteaders who tried the cave property. He might remember the path. Can you get word to him? I can ride out tomorrow morning if the lower road is clear enough. He paused. The hearing is in 10 days. Harwick said it quick, which is good for you. Aldrich likes to drag things out. Why is quick good for me? Because Silas is managing the aftermath of the storm on his own property right now. He lost a barn roof and significant livestock. He's dealing with his own crisis. Elias looked at her with the direct, careful look she'd come to trust. The longer this stays quick and focused on documentation, the worse it is for Aldrich's strategy. Aldrich works best when he has time to complicate things. Mara was still reading. She found a second reference, partly water-damaged but legible. The earlier of the two homesteaders, a man named Cartwright, describing the Northern Ridge Path as the route he used, in a letter that appeared to be correspondence with the land office about his failed homestead claim. The letter was dated 15 years ago, 4 years before Silas bought the eastern parcel. Elias, she said. He looked over. She put her finger on the Cartwright letter. This is 4 years before Silas's purchase. He looked at it. I know, that's the strongest piece. Why isn't this enough on its own? It might be. But Aldrich will argue that one letter isn't documentation of established public use. He'll say it was a private arrangement, not a recognized path. Elias paused. Whitley's testimony would close that argument. Personal knowledge of consistent use over time, predating the ownership claim. She nodded. She straightened the papers and pushed them back to him. Will you go to Whitley tomorrow? Yes, and I'll draft a summary of the documentation for the hearing, something Harwick can follow without having to interpret. He hesitated. You should be there. At the hearing. I was planning to be. And you should speak. Not just let me speak for you. He said this carefully, like he was navigating something. Harwick responds to the person with the direct interest. He likes to see that they're present and capable of making their own case. She looked at him. You think he has doubts about whether I can? I think Aldrich will try to create doubts, Elias said. The best counter to that is you, in the room, being exactly what you are. She thought about that. About what it meant to walk into a room where someone was going to argue that she was too marginal, too precarious, too little in the way of resources and standing to be worth protecting. She thought about doing that in front of a commissioner who was averse to conflict and would therefore be making constant assessments of which side was more trouble to rule against. What am I? She asked. Elias looked surprised by the question. Then he thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. A landowner with a documented right, he said. That's what you are in that room. She held on to that. All right. She bought supplies from him. More beans, more salt, lamp oil, a piece of actual canvas she could use to reinforce the windward side of the cabin exterior where the weather had found a soft spot in the clay ceiling. She paid from her remaining money and tried not to count what was left, because counting it right now would be demoralizing, and she didn't have time for demoralizing. At the door she stopped. Has Silas come in? Day after the storm broke, Elias said. He was looking at his damage report. He lost the north barn, full collapse, and he lost nearly 40 head of sheep. 40 head. Mara thought about that. Her 10 were alive and Silas had lost 40. She was not going to be the kind of person who found satisfaction in that. She would not let herself be that person. But the number was real, and what it meant for Silas's position was also real. The storm had cost him, significantly, in a way he had not anticipated and could not have entirely prevented. His margin was thinner than it had been in October. That didn't make him less dangerous. It might, in fact, make him more so. Reduced men who are accustomed to having resources tend to become aggressive about protecting what's left. She walked back up the ridge with her supplies. She spent the next week doing two things simultaneously, the way she'd learned to do most things: working the homestead during the daylight hours and working the hearing in her head during the rest of it. The homestead work was concrete. She patched the clay ceiling on the windward cabin wall with the canvas and fresh clay and let it cure in the cold, which it did slowly but adequately. She extended the woodpile by resuming cutting on the eastern slope, her shoulder complaining but functional. She checked Francis every morning and watched the ewe move back toward normal eating and normal behavior with the steady pragmatism of an animal that doesn't know it came close to dying and wouldn't think differently about its situation if it did. The hearing work was less concrete, which made it harder. She had no legal training. She had no experience with land office proceedings. She had the documentation that Elias had assembled and the argument built on it: established prior use, documented access predating Silas's adjacent ownership. And she had the knowledge of her own situation, which was as thorough as any knowledge she possessed. What she didn't have was certainty about how Aldrich would move against her, which meant she couldn't entirely prepare for the response. She thought about this on the fifth evening after the storm, sitting inside the cabin while the wind ran along the ridge outside and the stove ticked steadily. She thought about the thing Elias had said, that Aldrich's method was to complicate things. She thought about what complicating the path challenge would look like. It would mean introducing questions that weren't in the documentation. Questions about her character, her stability as a landowner, her capacity to maintain a legal claim. Questions about whether a woman in her position, the phrasing itself would be doing work, could be considered a party with sufficient standing. That was the move she'd be making, she thought, if she were Aldrich. She wrote it down on the paper bag that had become her thinking document. She wrote it down and looked at it and thought about what the response to it was. The response was 10 sheep alive, a water system, a stove she'd built herself, walls that had held through the worst storm in 20 years, a cougar driven off without a weapon, and a path that she'd dug out herself 4 days after the storm, while Silas's barns were still under snow. She wasn't going to bring those things into the hearing room as boasts. She was going to bring them in as evidence of what she was, which was exactly what Elias had told her to be: a landowner with a documented right, present in the room, capable of making her own case. She went to sleep with the specifics still running in her head and woke to Bracken's low growl. She was upright with the axe before she was fully conscious, which was the same pattern as the cougar night, except this time the cave mouth was dark, and there was no visible threat in the enclosure. Bracken was facing the cave mouth, not looking inside, looking out. She came to the entrance carefully. There was a man outside, standing about 40 feet down the path, just at the edge of the darkness, visible because the moon was up, and the snow reflected it well enough to make the night almost bright. He wasn't moving. He was standing with his hands at his sides, not doing anything, apparently just standing there. She recognized him after a moment. Not Cord, not Pete Rourke or Danny. A different man, broader, older, with a build that suggested someone who worked outdoors, but not in the way that made you lean, in the way that made you heavy. She didn't know his name, but she'd seen him twice in Red Hollow, standing near Silas, not quite beside him and not quite behind him. Part of the operational infrastructure of Silas Vance's business, whatever that meant specifically. She stood at the cave mouth with the axe in her right hand and said nothing. The man didn't move. After a moment he said quietly, without aggression, "I'm not here to do anything." "Then why are you here?" "To deliver a message." She waited. "Mr. Vance wants you to know he's prepared to offer fair value for the property and the animals," the man said. "Given the circumstances, he's willing to go to $80 for the land and the full flock." $80. Double his last offer. She held the axe at her side and thought about the timing of this. 2 days before the hearing, standing outside her cave in the moonlight at whatever hour this was, which felt like a deliberate intimacy that she was meant to find unsettling. "No," she said. The man didn't react. He'd expected that, she thought. "He thought you might say that. He asked me to also tell you that the hearing is going to be more complicated than you're expecting." A pause. "He said you're a capable woman and you've done well out here, and he has respect for what you've done. But the legal issues around that path are significant, and fighting them will cost you more than the land is worth. She looked at this man's face in the moonlight. He was saying what he'd been told to say, with the practiced neutrality of someone who has delivered messages for other people for long enough that the messages don't attach to him personally. Silas has respect for what I've done, she said. That's what he said. He said that about the woman he gave until Friday to clear out, after his son's funeral. Something moved through the man's face. Not guilt exactly, something adjacent to it. I just deliver the messages, ma'am. I know, she said. Here's mine. No. The same answer as last time. He forgot. The man nodded once. He turned and walked down the path. She watched him go, and then she stood at the cave mouth for a while in the cold moonlight, bracken beside her, the snow spread out like something that didn't care about any of it. She had not been frightened during that exchange. She thought about that afterward, trying to be honest with herself about it. There had been a version of her, the version that existed in October, the version that had walked up this ridge with everything she owned and was not entirely sure she was going to survive the first month. Who would have been frightened? Not paralyzed, but frightened. She had not been frightened. She'd been angry in that cold, focused way, and alert, and clear about her answer. She filed the exchange away. She went back to sleep. The morning of the hearing, she woke at first light and walked to Red Hollow in the cold. The land commissioner's office was a single room attached to the back of the building that served as the town hall, post-exchange, and occasional courtroom. It was not a large room. It held a long table, 6 chairs, a wood stove that wasn't drawing well, and filled the space with a faint smell of smoke. And Commissioner Harwick, a compact, gray-haired man with reading spectacles that he kept pushing up his nose, and a manner that confirmed everything Elias had said about his aversion to conflict. He was the kind of man who had made a life out of finding the most documentable path through any situation, because documentation didn't argue, and he found argument exhausting. Elias was already there when Mara arrived, with the assembled documents in a leather folder. He had brought Jem Whitley, who turned out to be a small, spare man of 81, with the kind of memory that very old people sometimes have. Not complete, not reliable for yesterday or last week, but crystalline for things that happened 40 years ago with a specificity that younger minds couldn't match. Aldrich arrived 5 minutes after Mara. She had been imagining him for weeks, and the actual person was less dramatic than the imagined version. A mid-40s man, slim, with a careful suit and the kind of practiced pleasantness that is recognizable as a professional tool. He greeted Harwick with the ease of someone who had been in this room before. He did not greet Mara. Silas was not there. Of course he wasn't. Clean hands. Harwick opened the proceeding with the formulaic brevity of a man who wanted it over with. He stated the nature of the challenge: right-of-way dispute, Northern Ridge Path, Ravens Hollow property, and asked Aldrich to present the basis of the claim. Aldrich presented it cleanly. He had good documents of his own. The deed language, a survey map that showed the path's crossing of the Vance eastern parcel, an affidavit from a land office clerk about the absence of a recorded easement. He laid them out on the table with the calm precision of a man who has done this many times and said, in a voice designed to sound reasonable, that the path crossed private land without documented legal right, and the landowner had both the standing and the legal authority to restrict access. Then he said, "We also want to note for Commissioner Harwick that the party claiming the right-of-way is a recent and single occupant who has been on the property for approximately 5 months, whose tenure at the property is not fully established, and whose capacity to maintain a legal interest in a prolonged dispute, he paused, just slightly, just enough. Unclear. Harwick looked up from his papers, looked at Mara over his spectacles. She met his look directly. She did not look down. She did not look uncomfortable. She looked like exactly what she was. Elias presented the counter-documentation methodically. The Cartwright letter, 15 years old, describing the path as established access, 4 years before Silas's purchase of the eastern parcel. The second sale reference. The land office survey from 12 years ago that noted the path without any annotation about private land restriction, which would have been required if the path were understood to cross private land without consent. He laid each piece out with the same precision Aldrich had used and spoke to each one in the straightforward language of a man who had run a business for 20 years and knew how to be clear. Then he put Jem Whitley at the table. Harwick asked him how long he'd lived in Red Hollow. 81 years, Whitley said. Born here. His father had built the first building on what was now Main Street, before the building that stood there now. Did he have knowledge of the Northern Ridge path? Yes, he said. He had ridden it himself as a young man when there was a prospector working the limestone outcroppings above the ridge. That would have been approximately 55 years ago. The path existed then. He described it with the crystalline old memory specificity that Elias had promised. The particular bend at the lower section, the limestone shelf at the midpoint, the way the path opened out at the cave mouth. 55 years ago. Aldrich's pleasantness developed a slight strain around the edges. Harwick pushed his spectacles up and looked at the survey map. He looked at the Cartwright letter. He looked at Jem Whitley, who looked back at him with the serenity of someone who has been alive long enough to have very little patience left for nonsense. Aldrich made two more arguments, both technical, both about the distinction between prior use and documented easement. Elias responded to each one from the documents. The back and forth had the quality of two people who understood the language of these proceedings much better than Harwick did, which was not a dynamic that served Harwick's preference for clarity. Then Harwick looked at Mara and said, in a tone that was asking a question while pretending to make a statement, "The property holder is present." "Yes," she said. "You've been occupying Ravens Hollow since October." "End of September," she said. 23 weeks. "Through the winter." "Yes." He looked at her. I was doing the thing she'd expected, assessing whether she was going to be the kind of problem that stayed or the kind that could be resolved. She looked back at him with the same directness she'd used with the man in the moonlight 2 nights before. "The storm," Harwick said. "You were at the property through the blizzard." 3 days, she said. "All 10 of my sheep survived." He was quiet. He looked at the documents again. He looked at Aldrich, who had the expression of someone waiting to object to something and not yet finding the opening. "The path," Harwick said. "You dug it out yourself after the storm?" 4 days of work, she said, starting the morning after the storm broke. Another pause. Harwick was not a complicated man. That was what Elias had said, and Elias had been right. He was a man who wanted documentation and a clear resolution and the absence of future difficulty. What he was looking at was a landowner who had survived a catastrophic winter alone and dug herself out of it before asking anyone for anything, with a stack of documents that established her path's prior use going back to before his own appointment as commissioner. On the other side was a challenge filed by a professional complicator on behalf of a man who wasn't in the room, based on a technical gap in a deed that had been exploited specifically because the window was narrow. Harwick pushed his spectacles up one final time. "The documented evidence of prior established use predates the adjacent land purchase," he said. "The challenge lacks sufficient basis to override established right-of-way." He made a note in his ledger. He looked at Aldrich. "The claim is denied." The room was quiet for a moment. Aldrich gathered his papers with the practiced composure of a man for whom losing was a known professional experience that he had developed a method for absorbing. He said nothing to Mara. He said nothing to Elias. He nodded to Harwick, who was already writing, and walked out. Elias let out a slow breath beside her. Jem Whitley made a sound that might have been satisfaction and pushed himself up from his chair with the effortfulness of 81 years and the dignity of someone who has just done something useful. Mara sat for a moment. She had been bracing for something, not consciously, but her body had been bracing for it. The specific physical tension of waiting for something to go wrong that had been present in her since the morning she'd walked into this building. She let it out now. It left slowly, the way tension does when it's been held for a long time. She looked at the document Harwick had noted in his ledger. She looked at the commissioner's back as he filed the papers. The path was hers. The access was hers. Elias touched her arm briefly. "Let's go," he said quietly. They came out of the land office into the cold afternoon street. Jem Whitley was escorted by a young woman who'd been waiting outside and walked him away with the gentle firmness of family. Elias and Mara stood on the boardwalk for a moment. "You were steady in there," Elias said. "I was scared," she said. He looked at her. "You didn't look it." "I know how to not look it," she said. "That's different." He almost smiled. "Fair enough." They stood for a moment in the winter light. Across the street, she could see Pete Rourke coming out of the livery. He saw her and stopped, and the look on his face told her he'd heard. Small towns move information faster than anything official. He gave her a single nod. She returned it. "What does Silas do now?" she asked Elias. Elias was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Losing the legal challenge in front of Harwick is a specific kind of loss for him. It's on record. He can't reframe it." He paused. "Men like Silas take that hard." "I know," she said. She knew it better than almost anyone, having spent 3 years in close proximity to exactly how Silas processed the distance between what he expected and what happened. He did not process it gracefully. He processed it by finding someone or something to hold responsible, and the holding could take forms that were creative and indirect and hard to trace back to him specifically. She had won the hearing. The path was documented and protected and on record in Harwick's ledger. She had not resolved Silas Vance. She walked back toward the ridge with the cold at her back and bracken at her heel and the hearing outcome in her pocket, and the understanding, clear and unromantic, that a problem going quiet was not the same as a problem being over. She reached the cave as the light was failing. She checked the sheep, all 10, Francis among them, doing fine. She checked the stove and the water and the firewood. She sat on her pallet with the pocket watch in her hand and turned it over once, the way she always did, and set it on the ground beside her. The cave was quiet around her. The stove ticked. Bracken settled with his head on her foot. She had come here in October with $40 and 10 sheep and a dog and a theory about what this cave could be. It was February now. The theory had mostly proven correct. The things she'd built had held. The things she'd argued had been documented and confirmed. She was not finished. She knew she was not finished. There were lambing season and the spring water levels to worry about, and the repair work the storm had left undone, and the ongoing question of Silas's next move, and the slow, unresolved process of converting survival into something that could be called a life rather than just a winter endured. But she was here. The cave was warm. The sheep were alive. The path was hers. For tonight, in the particular arithmetic of what she'd started with and what she had now, that was a surplus. She lay back. She slept. February moved into March the way it always does in mountain country, reluctantly, with setbacks, the cold refusing to concede the argument even when the evidence was clearly against it. There would be 3 days of softening, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes and the drip from the limestone wall increasing to something almost generous, and then a night would come in from the northwest and put everything back under a hard freeze that felt personal, felt like the season was making a point. Mara had stopped taking it personally by the 3rd week of February. The weather was not interested in her opinions about it, and she had learned to extend the same indifference in return. What she had not stopped thinking about was Silas. The hearing outcome had been recorded in Harwick's ledger, and that meant it was real in the durable way that written records are real, harder to dispute, harder to quietly undo, resistant to the kind of ambient pressure that Silas was skilled at applying. She understood that. But she also understood what Elias had said about men like Silas and specific kinds of loss, and she'd spent enough time in proximity to the man to know that the distance between a documented setback and an actual change of behavior was not automatic. It required something additional, something that made continued pursuit cost more than it returned. She hadn't figured out what that something was yet. She was working on it. In the meantime, she had lambing season to prepare for. 7 of her 10 ewes were pregnant. She'd known this since late October, had done the arithmetic on timing, and the math put the first deliveries in mid to late March. She had never assisted at a lambing before. Thomas had handled that side of the operation when they were on the Vance property, and before Thomas there had been no sheep to speak of, and before that she'd grown up in a household where animals were other people's concerns and not hers. She had read everything she could find on the subject, which amounted to 2 pages in an almanac that Elias had dug out of the back of his store, and 1 long afternoon conversation with Ruth Garfield, who had been lambing her own small flock for 15 years and spoke about it the way she spoke about most things, directly, without softening the difficult parts. "Some of them you lose," Ruth had said, "first-timers especially, and some of them you almost lose and then you don't, and that second group is the one that will ruin your sleep for the rest of lambing season because you'll be checking them every 2 hours like clockwork." "How do you know which group is which?" Ruth had given her a look. "You don't. Not until it's happening." Mara had filed that away like everything else. It was filed under things that are going to require her to tolerate uncertainty, which was a category that had been expanding steadily since September and showed no sign of stopping. She prepared the enclosure for lambing by extending the intersection, adding a secondary pen that could be used to separate ewes who were close to delivery from the general population. The extension took 4 days of work that her shoulder complained about continuously. She used the pine timber from the eastern slope and the remaining clay. And she built it with more care than she'd built the original enclosure, because she'd learned things since then about what held and what didn't, and this was for something that mattered more than containment. She was finishing the secondary pen one afternoon in the second week of March when she heard the horse on the ridge. She didn't stop working. She had developed a specific response to unexpected visitors at Raven's Hollow that consisted of continuing what she was doing and waiting to see what kind of problem it was before she adjusted her activity accordingly. This had served her well with Cord, less well with the man in the moonlight. She continued nailing the secondary pen rail while she listened to the horse come up the path. It was Silas. She knew his horse's gait the way you know things you've been around long enough. The deliberate, heavy-footed gray gelding. She came out of the enclosure and waited at the cave mouth. He looked different. She noticed it immediately and spent a moment cataloging what was different before he reached her, because she had learned that with Silas, the preliminary assessment was worth doing carefully. He was thinner. Not dramatically, not the thinness of illness, but the particular thinness of a man who had been under sustained pressure for a period of time and whose body had registered it before his manner did. The barn collapse and the livestock loss and the legal defeat had taken something from him that she hadn't expected to see displayed physically. He had always carried himself with the solidity of a man who considered the world's opinion of him already settled. That solidity was slightly, not dramatically, but perceptibly less. He pulled up the gray and sat for a moment looking at the cave, looking at the enclosure extension she'd been building, looking at the barrel, fuller now, with the increased melt drip, and the gutter system, looking at the cabin walls. Then he got down off the horse. That was different, too. He'd stayed mounted both previous times. Getting down meant he intended to stay longer than a message required. Mara kept her position at the cave mouth. She did not invite him in. "You've done more since December," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the enclosure extension. "Lambing season," she said. "I needed a secondary pen." He nodded slowly. He walked toward the enclosure and looked at the construction. She watched him look at it. The joints, the post depth, the way she'd integrated the new section with the original structure. His eyes were doing what she recognized as the inventory process, the same thing he'd done when he arrived in December, but the calculation behind it was different. She could see the difference in how long he paused at each element. "7 pregnant?" he asked. "Yes." "Your first lambing season?" "Yes." He looked at her then. For a moment he just looked, the way he hadn't really looked at her in all the years she'd been Thomas's wife and a fixture in his house. He had looked at her then in the way people look at furniture, aware of its presence in a functional sense, not interested in its particulars. This was a different look, reluctant, costly, the look of a man paying a debt he would have preferred not to have incurred. "The barn roof," he said. "I lost the north barn entirely, 41 sheep." He said the number carefully, like it still didn't sit right in his mouth. "And 6 head of cattle in the east paddock." She said nothing. She was not going to offer sympathy, and she was not going to gloat, and the space between those two things was most efficiently occupied by silence. "I wanted to see it," he said, gesturing at the cave, the enclosure, all of it. "What you'd done. I had people telling me about it. Elias, Pete Rourke, Danny Rourke." He paused. "Even the Harwick business. People talking about that." A pause. "I wanted to see it myself." "And?" she said. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him work through something internal, the specific struggle of a man who has organized his entire life around not being wrong, and is confronting a situation in which he has been comprehensively wrong and knows it, and cannot find an acceptable framing for the admission. "Thomas knew," Silas said. Not what she'd been expecting. His voice had changed, dropped slightly, lost some of the deliberate levelness he usually maintained. "What did Thomas know?" Silas looked away, at the ridge, at the limestone face. He told me, when he brought you home, that you were the most capable person he'd ever met. He said it flatly, the way you say something that has been accurate for a long time and is now painful in a way it didn't used to be. I thought he meant it the way young men mean things, the way you say something about the person you're in love with that has more feeling than fact in it. Mara kept her face still. She could feel the pocket watch against her hip where it sat in her coat pocket. I was wrong about that, Silas said. The words came out as though they'd been worked over for a while before they emerged. Not rehearsed. Worn smooth by repetition in the privacy of his own thinking. Among other things. She didn't say it was all right. It wasn't all right. It was accurate, what he'd said. He had been wrong about that, and about considerably more than that. But accurate and all right were different things, and she was done collapsing that distinction for other people's comfort. "What do you want, Silas?" she said. He looked back at her. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out. She didn't take it immediately. She looked at it. "What is this?" "Deed amendment," he said. "I had it drawn up by my own attorney, not Aldrich." He said the name with a flatness that told her the professional relationship there had been terminated. "It formalized the path easement, permanent, attached to both parcels, yours and mine. Can't be challenged by subsequent owners or filing." He paused. Elias looked at the language already. He said it was clean. Mara stared at the document. She had not expected this. She had been preparing, in the back of her thinking, for the next move, for whatever came after the legal challenge failed, for the version of pressure that followed the formal version. She had not been preparing for this. "Why?" she said. Silas lowered the document slightly. "Because I'm 63 years old, and I've lost 41 sheep and a barn, and my son has been dead for almost a year, and I am—" He stopped, cleared his throat, continued in a voice that was controlled but not entirely. "I'm tired of spending energy on things that are not going to change." He looked at the cave. "This is not going to change. You're not leaving." "No," she said. "I'm not." "I know." He held out the document again. "Take it. Not a trade, not an offer, just correcting something that should have been in the original deed." She took it. She unfolded it and read it standing there in the cold. The language was what he'd said. Clean, specific, permanent easement, both parcels named, no conditions. Her name and Silas Vance's name on the same document, doing something that looked, in its legal architecture, like a mutual recognition. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket alongside the watch. She looked at Silas Vance, her dead husband's father, the man who had put a watch on a table and said Friday, and walked out of the room, and she thought about what she wanted to say. There were a number of things. They had been accumulating since September, and some of them had been accumulating since the first year of her marriage, when she'd understood the particular shape of his indifference to her, and decided that expecting anything different was a project she didn't have energy for. What she said was, "I'm going to do well here." He looked at her. "I'm going to do well," she said again. "The lambs will come in March. I'll sell half of them in spring and use the money to extend the east side of the enclosure and plant root vegetables in the soil. Pocket on the south face where the limestone breaks. By next winter, I'll have a larger flock and a more complete food supply, and the water system will be sufficient to support expansion." She said it plainly, not defiantly. Just the plan as she understood it. "I'm telling you that so you know. Not so you can do anything about it, just so you know." He stood there in the cold and listened to her. And something happened in his face that she hadn't seen happen in his face before. Something that was not exactly emotion, but was the space where emotion had recently been and left a mark. Something that looked, around the eyes, like what a man looks like when he understands that he made the specific error of dismissing someone he should not have dismissed, and that understanding has come too late to be corrected and must simply be lived with. He nodded once, got back on the gray gelding, turned the horse. At the top of the ridge he stopped and looked back. "The lambing," he said. "If you need, I have a hand who's been doing it for 30 years. He said it carefully. Not as an offer exactly, more like information being made available that she could use or not. "His name is Gil. He'd come up if you sent word." She looked at him. She thought about pride, the specific kind that refuses help in order to prove something, which is a different kind of pride from the kind that knows the difference between refusing help you don't need and refusing help that would make you better at the thing you're trying to do. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. He rode down the ridge. She watched him until the path bent and took him out of sight. Then she stood for a while with the deed amendment in her pocket, and the cold coming off the limestone, and the sound of the sheep moving in the enclosure behind her. She was not done being angry at Silas Vance. She recognized that with the same plainness she tried to bring to everything. The anger was real, and the reasons for it were real, and they didn't disappear because he'd shown up with a document and a worn, smooth admission. What she had decided, standing there at the cave mouth, was that the anger could coexist with the document. She could hold both. She didn't have to resolve one into the other. She went back to work on the secondary pen. The first lamb came on the 19th of March from one of the older ewes, Margaret, who had been the lead animal of the flock since Mara walked them up the ridge in October, and who apparently intended to maintain that position through every subsequent development. The delivery was fast and uncomplicated in the way that experienced mothers sometimes are, and Mara was there for it but not really needed in any critical way, which was both a relief and faintly anticlimactic. The second and third came 2 days later from younger ewes, and those were slower and required more of her. She didn't sleep for 36 hours across those 2 deliveries, monitoring both animals through the night in the secondary pen, checking presentation and timing, and doing the things Ruth had told her to do in the order Ruth had told her to do them. And there was a period around 3 in the morning of the second night when the younger ewe, Frances, because it was always Frances, seemed to stall. And Mara sat in the enclosure in the cold with her hands doing things she'd never done before, and her heart doing things she'd rather it hadn't. And then Frances delivered a small, wet, indignant lamb that immediately made clear it intended to survive, and Mara sat back on her heels in the straw and breathed. She sent word to Gil, not because she couldn't manage, she was managing, but because 4 more ewes were due, and 2 of them were showing signs of potential complication, and the 36-hour sleeplessness was starting to affect the quality of her assessments in ways she could recognize but not entirely correct for. And Ruth had been right. The second group, the ones you almost lost, ruined your sleep anyway, so you might as well be getting the sleep you needed in between the crises. Gil arrived the following morning. He was a man of about 50, quiet in the way of people who have spent decades working with animals and have calibrated their presence accordingly. Small movements, low voice, no unnecessary noise. He looked at the enclosure and the secondary pen and the general setup without commenting on any of it, and then he looked at the 4 remaining pregnant ewes with the attention of someone reading a language he'd been fluent in for 30 years. "These 2, he said, pointing to the 2 Mara had flagged. "They'll need watching. The one on the left, she's carrying twins." He said it not as a revelation, but as a confirmation of something he'd assessed in about 45 seconds. "I thought so," Mara said. "I couldn't be certain." "You were right to flag her." He looked at the secondary pen, the construction, the fresh straw. "You've got a good setup here." She didn't say thank you. She said, "What do you see that I should change?" He thought about it. He walked around the pen, looked at the angles. Heat lamp would help if you had one, for the twins especially. Cave temperature is decent, but newborns need closer than decent. He paused. "You probably know that." "I don't have a lamp to spare," she said. "I was thinking about the stove, running a longer flue section to put a secondary heat source closer to the pen." He looked at her stove setup, looked at the flue angle, thought about it the way she'd learned to think about things. Not fast, not performing. "Might work," he said. "Depends on the draw. What gauge is your flue pipe?" They talked through it for 20 minutes, the practical specifics of heat distribution and flue engineering, and somewhere in that conversation, it stopped being about who had sent him and became about the problem in front of them, which was how most useful conversations go when the people in them are genuinely interested in the problem. He stayed 3 days. He slept in the cave on a bedroll he'd brought himself, near the enclosure, and he was there for the twins' delivery on the second night. Both alive, both strong enough, one slightly smaller than ideal but functional. And for the last 2 ewes on the third day, which both went smoothly. When he left, he shook her hand and said the setup was good. And she'd done well, and she thanked him in a way that meant it. She stood at the cave mouth and watched him ride down to the path and thought about the calculus of that. Gil sent by Silas, doing useful work, improving the outcome for her flock. The thing itself separate from its source, the help real regardless of where it had come from. She was not comfortable with this. She noted that she was not comfortable with it and filed it under things that didn't have to be resolved right now. 13 lambs, all alive. Frances had produced one and was feeding it with the anxious dedication of a first-time mother who has decided this is the most important thing that has ever happened and cannot stop checking on it. Mara watched Frances and the lamb for a while and felt something she recognized as uncomplicated happiness, which was the rarest of her emotional inventory and therefore worth noting when it appeared. Spring came to Raven's Hollow the way spring comes to high places, sideways, reluctantly, with the particular beauty of something earned rather than given. The snow retreated in stages, leaving behind a wet brown landscape that was not attractive in any conventional sense, but that felt, to Mara, like the most specific kind of promise. The ground was there. It had been there all winter under the snow, and it was still there, and things would grow in it. Ruth Garfield came up in the first week of April and walked around the whole property with her hands in her coat pockets and her head moving slowly, cataloging things. "The south face," she said, stopping at the section Mara had identified back in March. The place where the limestone broke and there was actual soil underneath, sheltered enough that it caught the afternoon sun for several hours. "You're going to plant here?" "Turnips," Mara said. "Hardy potatoes. Some onion sets." She paused. "Beans if the season goes long enough." Ruth crouched and dug her fingers into the soil. She looked at what she brought up. The texture, the color, the way it held together. "It's not bad," she said, which from Ruth was approximately equivalent to someone else saying it was excellent. "You'll want to work in some of the sheep manure from the enclosure before you plant." "I was planning to." Ruth stood up. She looked at the flock, the 10 original ewes, reduced now to 9, because Mara had sold one of the lower-producing ewes at a fair price in February, plus the 13 lambs in various stages of development. 22 animals. The 13 lambs were divided in Mara's plan. 8 would be sold in June when they'd reached sufficient weight, providing the capital she needed for the next phase, and 5 would be kept to expand the breeding flock. "You've thought this through," Ruth said. "I've had a long winter to think." Ruth smiled. Not the full smile of easy warmth. Ruth's smiles were economical, like everything else about her, but a real one. "That man Gil was here? From the Vance place?" "Silas sent him for the lambing," Mara said. "He was useful." Ruth's expression did something careful. "And Silas?" "He came in March, brought a deed amendment formalizing the path easement." She said it plainly. "And he told me Thomas had told him I was capable." She paused. "Years ago, apparently." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "What did you do with that?" "I put it in my pocket," Mara said, "along with the document." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the nod of a woman who has her own complicated history with powerful men making belated recognitions, and who understands that the right response is rarely as simple as either forgiveness or continued war, and who respects someone else arriving at that understanding without being instructed in it. "Come to dinner Sunday," Ruth said. "I've got a rooster that's been causing problems, and I intend to address that situation." "I'll come," Mara said. April was work. It was always work. She was not under any illusions that work was going to stop being the dominant feature of her days at Raven's Hollow for a long time yet, possibly ever. But it was work with a different character than the winter work. Winter work was defensive. It was holding. It was the constant maintenance of survival against a thing that was trying to end it. Spring work was offensive, in the military sense, moving forward, taking ground, building towards something instead of preventing the loss of something. She worked the south face soil for 2 weeks, turning in the composted manure from the enclosure, breaking up the limestone-heavy sections with a pick, and removing the rocks by hand. It was the kind of work that was satisfying in the physical way that very direct work can be satisfying. The thing in front of you and the tool in your hand and the result visible at the end of each hour. Her shoulder had improved significantly since February. The grinding had not disappeared entirely. She suspected it never would, that she had done some permanent rearrangement of the joint that winter. But it had become manageable, something she worked around instead of through. She planted in the second week of April, pressing the seed sets into the turned soil with the particular care of someone who understood that each one was not just a vegetable but a calculation about the future. The first week of May, she sold her first lambs. She had sent word to Pete Rourke, who had expressed interest in March, and Pete came up with Danny and 2 of the other ranchers from the territory south of Red Hollow, men she recognized from the general landscape of Red Hollow, but who had not previously had occasion to speak with her directly. They came in the practical way that livestock buyers come, to assess before they agreed to price, and they walked through the flock with the same professional assessment that Gil had applied to the pregnant EBVs, and that Mara had learned to read by now as the specific language of people who knew animals. The lambs were good. She had known they were good, but knowing it and having people who understood the measure of good confirm it were different things, and she stood with her arms crossed while Pete and the other men made their evaluations and felt the particular satisfaction of having produced a thing that held up under scrutiny. Pete offered her a fair price. Not generous. Pete Rourke was constitutionally incapable of a generous first offer, she suspected, but fair. She negotiated. Not dramatically, not with the performance of toughness that some people brought to negotiation. She just had a number she'd calculated as correct, and she said it, and she waited. She got within $2 of her number. One of the other ranchers, a man named Harmon, whose family had lost their entire flock in the blizzard and were rebuilding from nothing, bought 3 lambs from her and stood looking at the cave and the enclosure and the water system for a long time afterward. "I've got a cave on my south property," he said finally. "Small one. Mostly just used it for equipment storage." "Limestone?" Mara asked. "I think so. Never paid much attention to the walls." "Check if the walls sweat," she said. "The moisture comes off limestone under specific conditions. If you've got seepage, even minor, you can capture it. It's slow accumulation, but it doesn't stop." Harmon looked at her. He was a man who'd been ranching for 20 years and had not previously received useful infrastructure advice from a woman he'd considered unlikely to last a winter. The adjustment happening in his expression was visible and not entirely comfortable, and she did not try to make it easier for him because it was not her job to make his recalibration painless. "I'll check it," he said. She nodded. He left with the other buyers, and Danny Rourke helped her count the payment, and she put it in the tin box she kept in the cave wall niche, next to the almanac and the original deed. And she sat for a moment with the box in her hands, thinking about $46 in October, and what she had now, and the distance between those 2 points. It wasn't a large amount of money. It wasn't security in any permanent sense. It was a beginning, which was something different, and in some ways more meaningful than security, because security could be taken, and a beginning, once made, could not be unmade. It had happened. It was in the record. She had sold lambs from a flock she'd raised through a catastrophic winter in a cave that everyone had called worthless. She put the box back in the niche and went to check on Francis. Elias came up the ridge in mid-May with his supply horse and a look on his face that she had come to recognize as the precursor to news. He tied the horse and walked to the cave mouth and looked at the south face planting, where the turnip greens were emerging in a way that was modest but real, and at the expanded enclosure, and at the flock, fuller now, more alive seeming in the way that animals get in spring when the cold is gone and the grass is coming in. "Silas is selling the eastern parcel," he said. She turned and looked at him. "Not to pressure you," Elias said quickly. "I don't think. He's contracting the whole ranch operation, the storm losses and the legal costs and some debts that apparently predated all of this." He paused. "He's keeping the main property and the house, but the adjacent parcels he's selling. Who's buying the eastern one?" "That's what I came to tell you." Elias looked at her carefully. "He's offered it to you first. Right of first refusal, given the path easement, below market value." Mara stood very still. The eastern parcel. The land the path crossed. The land that Aldrich had tried to use as a weapon against her. If she owned it, the path issue was permanently settled in a way that no future filing could touch. And the eastern parcel had the pine slope she'd been cutting timber from, which she'd been doing with the awkward status of using land she didn't own because no one had stopped her, and the alternative was no timber. And the lower section of the eastern parcel had the rain pool she'd used in the first months before her barrel system was fully operational. "How far below market?" she said. Elias told her the number. She did arithmetic in her head, fast, because she'd been doing this arithmetic in various configurations all winter and knew the numbers intimately. What she had, what the lambs had brought, what she would have after the second sale in June, what she needed to keep in reserve for the next winter's preparations. It was close. It was very close. It was the kind of close that required either everything going right or something else coming in, and she had learned by now to be skeptical of plans that required everything to go right. "I need a week," she said. "He gave 2 weeks," Elias said. "Take the time." He left the supplies and went back down the ridge. Mara stood at the cave mouth with the afternoon light on the south face planting and the sound of the flock behind her and thought. She thought for 2 days. She walked the eastern parcel on the third day, the full boundary, in the way she'd walked Raven's Hollow before she bought it, looking at what was actually there, not what she'd been told to expect or what she hoped to find. The pine slope was good timber, manageable from her cave property with the right equipment. The lower section had 3 distinct soil pockets where the limestone broke, more planting potential than she had on the south face. The rain pool was fed by a drainage pattern from the upper ridge that would be reliable in most years. She looked at all of it and thought about what it could be. Not immediately. Not this year. Over years, with sustained work. On the 4th day, she rode down to Red Hollow and went to see Ruth Garfield, who lived on the East Fork and whose opinion she had come to trust, in the particular way you trust someone who has been honest with you even when the honesty was inconvenient. She told Ruth the situation. Ruth sat across from her at the kitchen table and listened without interrupting. When Mara finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Can you afford it?" Ruth said. "Barely," Mara said. "If the June lambs bring what I expect, and if they don't, then I'm short and I have to find the difference somewhere else." Ruth looked at her. "What do you want to do?" "I want to buy it," Mara said. It came out simply, without the hesitation she'd been carrying around the question for 4 days. Saying it plainly clarified it. "I want to buy it because the timber is there and the soil pockets are there, and the path will never be a problem again, and because—" She stopped, thought about how to say the next part honestly. "Because Silas offered it to me. Because he's the one who tried to take the path, and now he's the one handing me the land the path crosses. And I think there's something right about accepting that. Not for him, for me." Ruth considered this. She had a way of considering things that was visible. You could see her turning it over, looking at it from different angles, not rushing toward a verdict. "The money risk is real," Ruth said. "I know. You've been managing real risks all winter. I know that too." Ruth got up and went to the back of the kitchen. She came back with a tin box of her own, smaller than Mara's, older, the lid slightly bent. She set it on the table and opened it. Inside was money. Not a large amount, but a real one. "This is a loan," Ruth said. "Not a gift. Terms. You pay me back after the June sale, whatever you can, and the remainder after the fall. No interest. I'm not a bank." She paused. "I also want to see your water system properly diagrammed before winter, so I can try to build one on my east property." Mara looked at the money. She looked at Ruth. "Why?" she said. The same question she'd asked Cord in the doorway of the cave on the night he'd come to tell her the truth. The question she kept asking because the answers kept surprising her. Ruth sat back down. "Because I've been in Red Hollow for 20 years, and I've watched this valley make the same judgments about the same kinds of people for 20 years. And occasionally someone comes along who makes those judgments look stupid. And when that happens, I think it's worth putting some money on it." She paused. "Also, I genuinely want the water system diagram." Mara laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere genuine and arrived without warning. She hadn't laughed like that she couldn't remember exactly when. A long time. She bought the eastern parcel. The transaction was handled through Elias with the combined funds, her lamb money and Ruth's loan. She signed the papers in the same back office where she'd signed the original Raven's Hollow deed, and Elias stamped the transfer with the same compressed efficiency he brought to everything, and she walked out of his store with a second deed in her coat pocket and stood on the boardwalk for a moment in the May sunshine, feeling the weight of what had just happened. The eastern parcel. The path that crossed it, now hers from one end to the other. The timber slope. The soil pockets. All of it connected to the cave and the cabin and the original 160 acres that everyone had called worthless in September. She did not feel finished. She was constitutionally unable to feel finished. She suspected there was always the next thing, the next problem, the next season to prepare for, and that was not a complaint. That was just the architecture of the kind of life she was building, which was not a life that arrived complete and stayed that way, but one that had to be continuously made. But she felt the ground under her, solid and real. She walked back up the ridge for the last time that day. The path was clear, well worn now from months of use, the landmarks she'd learned in the early weeks as familiar as furniture. The limestone outcropping at the midpoint, the bend where the eastern parcel came into view. The cave mouth, wide and dark and dry, with the south face planting visible from 50 feet away, the green of it specific and improbable against the limestone. She stopped at the cave mouth. Bracken pressed against her leg from beside. The flock was settled in the enclosure. She could hear them, the specific sound of content animals, which she'd learned to distinguish from the sounds of animals that were not content. The stove was banked low. The barrel was 3/4 full. The turnip greens on the south face were growing at a rate that would make them harvestable by August. She sat down outside the cave mouth. Not because she had time to sit, she always had the next thing, but because she decided deliberately and without apology to take 10 minutes and sit. She took the pocket watch out of her coat, turned it over once the way she always did, held it in her palm. She thought about Thomas. She thought about what he'd told his father years ago in the plain declarative way he had, the most capable person he'd ever met. And she thought about what it had taken her to understand that he'd been right. Not because she'd needed his validation to know her own worth, but because love, when it's honest, sees something true. And being seen truly by someone you loved and lost is a gift that outlasts the person who gave it. And she'd been carrying that gift in her pocket for months without fully acknowledging what it was. She was not the same person who had walked up this ridge in October. She was the same person in the factual sense, same body, same history, same name. But the interior version was different, harder in some places, she knew, more calloused over sections that had been soft before. She did not think that was entirely a good thing. Calluses were protection, but they were also distance, and she was going to have to watch that. The tendency towards self-sufficiency becoming the habit of not letting things in, which was a different kind of loneliness from the one she'd been trying to escape. She knew that about herself now. She hadn't known it in September. That was the other accounting, not just the external things she'd built and proved and won, but the internal inventory, the things she understood about her own nature that she hadn't understood before. She was stubborn in ways that served her and stubborn in ways that didn't. She was capable of more than she'd been told she was, which she'd proven, but she was also capable of being wrong, which she'd proven too in small ways throughout the winter. Small misjudgments, small overconfidences that had required correction. She was not the sum of what Silas had dismissed or what Thomas had loved or what Red Hollow had underestimated. She was something more and less than all of those projections. She was just herself, working it out. The light was going gold over the ridge, the long light of a May evening in mountain country, the kind that turns everything it touches slightly more significant looking than it probably is. The limestone face of the cave caught it and went from gray to amber. The south face planting was briefly luminous. She was not finished. She was going to repair the east wall of the cabin this summer before the clay shrank further in the heat. She was going to build a proper cold storage into the back of the cave where the temperature stayed low year-round. She was going to start on the eastern parcel timber assessment in June. She was going to pay Ruth back with interest regardless of what Ruth had said about not being a bank, because that was who she intended to be. She was going to diagram the water system for Ruth before October, carefully, in a way that someone else could actually follow and build from. She was going to do all of that and probably more things she couldn't see yet, because the future, unlike the cave wall, did not reveal itself by simply paying sustained attention. You just walked into it and made decisions when they came up and tried to learn faster than the consequences arrived. That was the whole of it. There was no other secret. She put the watch back in her pocket. She stood up. She looked at Raven's Hollow. The cave, the cabin, the enclosure, the planting, the ridge path running down through the eastern parcel that was now hers. And she felt what she felt, which was tired and capable and not finished and alive in a way that was specific and earned and could not be taken. Then she went inside to check the sheep and bank the stove for the night. The lantern burned behind her as the evening came on. From down the ridge, if anyone had been looking up, it would have been visible for a long time. That single warm point of light in the limestone face, steady and small and absolutely there.